December 1944, a single-engine plane carries America's most famous bandleader across the English Channel. He never arrives, no wreckage, no distress call. The man whose music filled the war vanishes into fog. A Polish leader, who had pushed for an investigation into Soviet massacres, boards a plane for London. 16 seconds after takeoff, it crashes into the sea. Only the pilot survives. World War II is the most documented conflict in human history. Every battle mapped, every ship catalogued, every decision is archived. But within that vast record, there are gaps. Men who disappeared, ships that sank without witness, orders given for reasons never captured, a Gestapo chief who simply ceased to exist in May 1945, a diplomat who saved thousands, only to be arrested and never seen again. These aren't just mysteries. They're absences, names without graves, questions without answers. Over the next 3 hours, we'll examine 23 of these unsolved cases. Some mysteries have theories, some have only questions. Story 1. A submarine that never returned. ORP Orzel the Eagle was a Polish submarine operating under British command after Poland's fall in September 1939. By the spring of 1940, she had already earned a reputation. Her crew had escaped internment in Estonia, navigated the Baltic without charts, and reached Britain to continue the fight. The boat herself was a modern design. Diesel-electric propulsion, 12 torpedo tubes, a crew of 60. In May 1940, she departed on patrol into the North Sea and Skagerrak, hunting German shipping in the narrow waters between Norway and Denmark. She never returned to port. The last confirmed contact came in late May 1940. After that, silence. No distress signal, no debris field, no survivors, no wreck. The sea offered no explanation, and the war moved on. Families waited. Fellow submariners searched patrol grids and shipping logs. Months passed, then years. ORP Orzel was declared lost with all hands, 60 men whose final moments remain unknown. Submarine warfare in 1940 was a calculated risk wrapped in steel. A boat on patrol operated alone, submerged for hours or days, surfacing only to charge batteries and ventilate the compartments. Communication with base was minimal radio silence, maintained operational security. Crew lived in a tube, barely wide enough to stand upright, breathing recycled air thick with diesel fumes and the smell of unwashed bodies. Meals were cold. Sleep came in shifts. The hull groaned under pressure at depth, rivets straining against thousands of tons of water pressing inward. The Skagerrak presented particular dangers. German forces controlled the Norwegian coastline by May 1940, and the waters were heavily patrolled. Minefields guarded key transit routes. Anti-submarine patrols used depth charges and hydrophones to hunt contacts. A single mistake surfacing in sight of an enemy aircraft, crossing a minefield in poor visibility, failing to dive fast enough when spotted, could end in catastrophe. And because submarines operated submerged and alone, catastrophe often came without witnesses. Theories about Orzel's fate multiplied in the absence of evidence. She might have struck a mine. German and British minefields littered the North Sea, and charts were incomplete. She might have been sunk by depth charges after being detected on the surface or caught diving. Mechanical failure could have caused flooding faster than the crew could respond. A collision with another vessel, friendly or enemy, might have torn open the pressure hull. Internal accident, fire, explosion, toxic gas could have incapacitated the crew before they could surface or send a distress call. Each possibility fit the available facts, which were almost none. The submarine departed on patrol. The submarine did not return. Everything between those 2 points remained inference. What made Orzel's disappearance particularly haunting was the boat's prior history of improbable survival. In September 1939, after Poland's invasion, Orzel had fled to the Estonian port of Tallinn, where international law required her internment. The Estonians removed critical navigation equipment and placed guards aboard, yet the crew overpowered the guards, slipped out of the harbor at night, and navigated the Baltic Sea toward Britain. Using improvised charts and dead reckoning, they evaded German and Soviet patrols, crossed minefields, and arrived in Britain as heroes, proof that determination could overcome impossible odds. For such a boat and such a crew to simply vanish felt like a cruel reversal. The sea that had once allowed their escape now swallowed them whole. No final radio message, no floating wreckage, no bodies washing ashore, just silence and the slow bureaucratic acknowledgement that 60 men would not be coming home. The families of the lost crew faced a particular kind of grief, the absence of certainty. A sailor killed in surface combat might have witnesses, a marked grave, a clear narrative of his final moments. The crew of Orzel had none of that. Their end was somewhere in the cold water, at some unknown depth, for some unconfirmed reason. The submarine became a tomb without a headstone, resting on the seabed in a location never precisely determined. Britain's submarine service recorded the loss and moved on. The war demanded it. Other boats departed on patrol. Other crews took the same risks. The nature of submarine warfare meant that losses like Orzel's were not anomalies, they were occupational hazards. By 1945, dozens of submarines from multiple navies had vanished in similar fashion, their fates reconstructed through speculation and probability rather than evidence. Decades later, maritime archaeologists and historians occasionally searched for the wreck, using sonar and archival research to narrow the search area. The Skagerrak and North Sea yielded other wrecks, merchant ships, warships, aircraft, but not Orzel. If she rests on the bottom, the sea has kept her hidden. If she was obliterated by an explosion, the fragments scattered beyond recovery. Either way, the physical evidence remained elusive. What endured was the human dimension of the mystery. 60 men aboard a submarine represent 60 individual lives. Submariners who chose a dangerous specialty, Poles who continued fighting after their nation's defeat, sailors who trusted their boat and each other. Each had a name, a family, a reason for being there. The absence of their remains did not erase their service, but it complicated remembrance. How does a nation honor men whose graves are unknown and whose deaths are undocumented? The mystery of ORP Orzel exemplifies a recurring theme in wartime naval operations. The sea's capacity to erase evidence. Unlike land battles, where terrain holds traces, shell craters, foxholes, debris, naval combat leaves little behind. Ships sink, currents disperse wreckage, depth obscures remains, and so, the record fills with entries like Orzel's. Departed on patrol, failed to return, presumed lost, cause unknown. Story 2. HMS Glorious. 3 days in the water. HMS Glorious was an aircraft carrier, returning from Norway on June 8, 1940, escorted by 2 destroyers, Acasta and Ardent. The Norwegian campaign had ended in Allied withdrawal, and Glorious carried RAF Hurricanes and Gladiators that had been fighting ashore, their pilots having landed aboard despite no prior carrier training. The ship steamed south through the Norwegian Sea, heading for Skarpa Flow, when smoke appeared on the horizon. 2 German battlecruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, were also at sea, returning from their own operations off Norway. The meeting was unexpected. Glorious had no aircraft aloft on patrol. Her lookouts spotted the enemy late. The range closed rapidly. The battlecruisers opened fire at extreme distance. Shells fell around the carrier and her escorts. Glorious attempted to launch aircraft, but there was no time. The first hits came quickly, 11-inch shells punching through the flight deck and hangar, starting fires, killing men, destroying planes before they could take off. The destroyers laid smoke and turned to attack, buying time with their lives. Acasta and Ardent charged the battlecruisers, closing the range to launch torpedoes. Both were destroyed by concentrated gunfire, their thin hulls shredded by shells designed to penetrate battleship armor. Acasta managed one final torpedo salvo before sinking. One torpedo struck Scharnhorst, causing flooding and forcing the German ships to break off the action. But by then, Glorious was finished. The carrier listed heavily, fires raging across multiple decks. Abandoned ship orders were given. Men climbed into the water or onto life rafts. Glorious capsized and sank within hours of the first hit. Over 1,500 men from the carrier and her 2 escorts went into the Norwegian Sea. The water temperature hovered just above freezing. The nearest land was Norway, occupied by German forces. The nearest friendly port was Scotland, hundreds of miles to the south. No distress signal reached Britain. Glorious had maintained radio silence, and her final transmissions, if any were sent, were never confirmed as received. The destroyers went down too fast to call for help. The German battlecruisers, damaged and pursued by reports of British heavy units in the area, withdrew toward Germany. They did not stop to pick up survivors. They did not report the engagement immediately in a way that reached Allied intelligence. The men floated in the North Atlantic, waiting for rescue that did not know they needed rescuing. Hypothermia sets in quickly in cold water. The body loses heat faster than it can generate warmth. Fingers go numb. Shivering becomes violent, then stops. Consciousness fades. Most men died within hours. A few, clinging to rafts or wreckage, lasted longer. The sea was empty. No merchant ships passed. No patrol aircraft flew overhead. The survivors called out to each other across the waves, voices growing weaker, until the voices stopped. 3 days later, a Norwegian merchant ship and a German seaplane spotted rafts and wreckage. They recovered survivors, 43 men total, from over 1,500. The rest had died of exposure, drowning, or injuries sustained in the sinking. The cold water had killed them as surely as the shells. The survivors brought back fragments of the story. They described the sudden appearance of enemy ships, the brief and hopeless battle, the carrier's death throes, the long hours in the water, watching shipmates slip away. Their testimony filled in some blanks, but it also raised questions that would persist for decades. Why had Glorious sailed without air patrol aloft? Carriers routinely maintained combat air patrols precisely to avoid surprise. Why were her escorting destroyers so few and so lightly armed? Why was radio silence maintained even when under attack, preventing any chance of calling for help? Why did British naval intelligence fail to anticipate the German battlecruisers' movements, leaving Glorious in their path? The answers were complex and unsatisfying. Glorious had been operating under orders shaped by the chaotic final days of the Norwegian campaign. Air operations had been reduced to conserve fuel and aircraft for the evacuation. Escort assignments reflected the limited destroyers available after weeks of intense operations. Radio silence was doctrine, intended to prevent enemy direction finding. Intelligence failures stemmed from the fog of war, incomplete information, delayed reports, competing priorities. But these explanations, while factually defensible, did not address the deeper question. How did a major warship and 2 destroyers sink without anyone in the British command structure knowing until days later? The loss of over 1,500 men should have triggered immediate search and rescue operations. Instead, the men floated and died, while their navy remained unaware. The Glorious disaster became a case study in the brittleness of naval operations. A single encounter, lasting only a few hours, erased 3 ships and 1,500 lives. The decisions that placed those ships in harm's way were made by officers acting on incomplete information under pressure. The consequences were catastrophic and irreversible. Families of the lost men struggled with the details. The Admiralty's official account provided a basic narrative sunk by enemy action. Heavy losses, few survivors, but it left gaps. Why had their sons and husbands died in the water rather than in battle? Why had no one come for them? Why had the carrier been caught so unprepared? Survivors carried their own burdens. They had lived, while shipmates died. They had listened to men calling for help and been unable to help. They had watched rafts drift apart, bodies slip under the surface, faces they knew disappear into the cold. The memory of those 3 days haunted them. Historians later examined the engagement from multiple angles. German records confirmed the timeline and the hits scored. British records documented the loss and the survivors' rescue. Technical analyses explored the vulnerabilities of carrier operations and the lethality of battlecruiser firepower. Yet, even with extensive documentation, key decisions remained difficult to fully explain. The carrier's captain, Guy Doyley Hughes, went down with his ship, taking with him any personal rationale for his decisions that day. The air staff, who set the operational parameters, were operating under the strain of a failed campaign and a desperate evacuation. The Naval Command, coordinating movements across the North Sea, juggled a dozen priorities simultaneously. No single person bore sole responsibility, yet the cumulative effect of their choices was disaster. What made the loss particularly painful was the element of chance. Had Glorious sailed a different route or at a different time, the German battlecruisers would have missed her. Had air patrols been maintained, the enemy might have been spotted earlier, allowing time to maneuver or call for support. Had radio silence been broken, rescue ships might have reached the survivors before hypothermia claimed them. Small variations in timing, procedure, or luck could have changed the outcome entirely. But the war did not operate on hypotheticals. It operated on what happened. And what happened was that over 1,500 men died because their ship encountered an enemy she could not fight, in conditions that prevented escape or rescue, with safeguards that failed at every critical juncture. The wreck of HMS Glorious rests on the floor of the Norwegian Sea, deep enough that recovery or detailed exploration has never been attempted. The destroyers lie nearby, their positions approximated, but not confirmed. The sea holds the physical evidence, but the human cost is measured in the lives that ended there. Sailors who burned, drowned, or froze. Pilots who never reached their cockpits. Gunners who fired until their ships went under. The sinking of HMS Glorious remains one of the Royal Navy's worst single-day losses of the war. It also remains one of its most scrutinized, not because of deliberate secrecy, but because the answers to why it happened are distributed across dozens of decisions made by multiple people under conditions that no longer exist. The result is a narrative that is clear in its facts and ambiguous in its full meaning. A story told by survivors who can describe what they saw, but not always why it happened. 3 days in the water, 43 men saved, over 1,500 lost, and a set of questions that outlived the war. Story 3. The halt at Dunkirk. Along the canal line south of Dunkirk, German panzer divisions sat idle beneath the spring sky, while the greatest prize of the war, the British Expeditionary Force, and remnants of the French First Army remained trapped against the sea just miles ahead. It was May 24th, 1940. The Blitzkrieg that had shattered Poland in weeks and torn through France in days had brought the Wehrmacht to the edge of total victory in the West. Then came the order that would puzzle historians for generations. Halt. The directive arrived from Army Group A headquarters, transmitted down through corps and division commanders to tank crews who had been rolling forward without pause for 2 weeks. Engines cooled. Gunners climbed out to stretch in the sun. Officers studied maps and waited. Behind them, the roads of northern France bore the scars of their advance, burned-out vehicles, refugees scattered in ditches, entire towns bypassed in the rush toward the coast. Ahead lay Dunkirk, its harbour crowded with soldiers who had no way out. The official reasoning shifted depending on who spoke. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring reportedly assured Hitler that his bombers could finish the job from the air, eliminating the need to risk precious armour in the marshy Flanders lowlands. Army commanders cited terrain concerns. The ground near Dunkirk was laced with canals and drainage ditches unsuitable for tanks. Logistical officers pointed to supply lines stretched thin after the rapid advance, with fuel and ammunition stocks running low. Some historians later suggested Hitler harbored hopes of a negotiated peace with Britain, and preferred not to humiliate the British Army completely. What remains indisputable is the outcome. The halt order gave the Allies time desperately needed, hours that became a day, then 2, then 3. On May 26th, the British Admiralty launched Operation Dynamo, the emergency evacuation of Dunkirk. Over 9 days, a hastily assembled fleet of naval destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, and ferries crossed the channel repeatedly under German air attack. By June 4th, when the last ship departed, 338,226 Allied troops had been lifted off the beaches and harbour mole, a number that astonished even those who planned the operation. The beaches themselves became a study in improvisation and endurance. Soldiers waded into the surf up to their necks, queuing in long lines that stretched into the waves, waiting for boats that might never come. Destroyers and minesweepers pulled alongside the East Mole, a narrow timber and concrete breakwater never designed for such traffic, and loaded men as fast as gangplanks allowed. Smaller craft ferried troops from the shallows to larger ships waiting offshore. Overhead, Spitfires and Hurricanes of the Royal Air Force fought running battles with Luftwaffe bombers, trading altitude for speed in dogfights that left contrails scratched across the spring sky. The German army resumed its advance on May 27th, but by then, the window had narrowed. Armour met stronger resistance as British and French rearguards fought delaying actions along the shrinking perimeter. Luftwaffe attacks sank ships and killed men on the beaches. Yet the evacuation continued. Each day brought another wave of vessels. Another few thousand soldiers pulled from the sand. Each night, fires from burning oil tanks lit the horizon, and the sound of artillery crept closer. Inside the planning rooms in London, staff officers worked with maps and tide tables, calculating capacity and turnaround times with the precision of men gambling everything on arithmetic. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, newly in office, authorized the operation while preparing the British public for catastrophic losses. Initial estimates suggested perhaps 30,000 men might be saved. When the final count came in over 300,000, it felt less like military success than miraculous reprieve. Yet the miracle rested on a foundation of German hesitation. The halt order remains one of the most scrutinized decisions of the war precisely because its logic was never singular. Multiple explanations exist in the historical record, each supported by credible evidence, none sufficient alone to silence debate. Did Hitler truly believe Göring's bombers could finish the job? Did terrain concerns outweigh the strategic value of destroying the British expeditionary force? Did political considerations about future negotiations with Britain influence military judgment? Or was it simply caution, a commander's reflex to consolidate gains before pushing forward into uncertain ground? The lack of a definitive answer stems from the nature of high-level decision-making in wartime. Orders are issued, executed, and archived, but the conversations that produce them, the doubts, the competing pressures, the unspoken assumptions often leave fainter traces. Surviving records show that multiple officers contributed input, that weather and logistics were discussed, that confidence in air power ran high. What they do not show is a single, incontestable motive that explains why the tanks sat idle while an army escaped. For the men lifted off those beaches, the reason mattered less than the result. They returned to Britain exhausted, often without weapons or equipment, but alive. Many would fight again in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy. The evacuation preserved not just manpower, but morale and the possibility of future resistance. Britain remained in the war, its army bruised but not broken, its resolve stiffened by survival against improbable odds. The halt order became a turning point not through what it achieved but through what it prevented. Had the panzers rolled into Dunkirk unopposed on May 24th, the war might have taken a different course. Instead, the gap between decision and action measured in hours and miles allowed history to pivot. The beaches emptied, the boats sailed, and the first great mystery of the war settled into the archives, documented in orders and after-action reports, yet resistant to complete explanation. Story 4. U-47 and the last radio message. U-47 was one of Germany's most successful U-boats, commanded by Günther Prien, the officer who had penetrated Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sunk the British battleship HMS Royal Oak. By early 1941, Prien and his crew had become legends in the Kriegsmarine, celebrated in propaganda, decorated for their kills, symbols of U-boat effectiveness. When U-47 departed on patrol in February 1941, It carried a crew of 45 men and a reputation built on calculated aggression. On March 7, 1941, while hunting convoy OB-293 southwest of Iceland, U-47 transmitted a contact report. The message was brief and routine. Enemy convoy sighted, position given, attacking. It was the last confirmed communication from the boat. No further messages came. No return to port notification. No distress signal. U-47 simply stopped transmitting. Days passed. U-boat command waited. Patrol schedules allowed for radio silence, and it was not uncommon for boats to go quiet while stalking convoys or evading counterattack. But when the scheduled return date came and went without word, concern grew. Search protocols were initiated. Allied shipping records were examined for any report of a U-boat sinking. Nothing matched. Weeks became months. U-47 was declared overdue, then presumed lost. 45 men were written off. Families were notified. The propaganda machine went silent about Prien. The war moved on. The exact cause of U-47's loss has never been definitively established. Several possibilities exist, each supported by fragments of evidence but none confirmed beyond doubt. One theory centers on HMS Wolverine, a British destroyer escorting convoy OB-293. On March 7th through 8th, Wolverine reported attacking a submerged contact with depth charges. The location and timing align with U-47's last known position. Depth charge attacks were logged, underwater explosions recorded. Yet Wolverine did not report definitive destruction. No wreckage surfaced, no oil slick confirmed a kill. The Royal Navy credited Wolverine with a probable, but not a certain sinking. Another possibility is a mine. The waters southwest of Iceland were mined by both British and German forces. A U-boat transiting on the surface or at periscope depth could strike a mine without warning. The explosion would be catastrophic pressure, hull breached, compartments flooding faster than watertight doors could seal. The boat would sink in seconds, too fast for the crew to escape or send a distress call. Minefields were imperfectly charted, and U-boats sometimes wandered into them by accident or necessity. Mechanical failure offers a third explanation. Type 6B U-boats, while reliable, were complex machines operating under extreme conditions. Diesel engines, electric motors, batteries, ballast systems, all had to function flawlessly hundreds of feet underwater. A catastrophic failure in the diving system could send the boat into an uncontrolled descent past crush depth. A battery explosion could fill compartments with toxic gas. A hull fracture from metal fatigue could lead to rapid flooding. Any of these could kill the crew before they had time to surface or signal. Collision is another candidate. The North Atlantic was crowded with shipping convoys, escorts, lone merchants. A U-boat, running submerged or on the surface at night, could collide with a vessel that never knew it had struck anything. A merchant ship's hull, crushing into a submarine's conning tower, would leave the U-boat crippled or destroyed, while the surface ship sailed on unaware. Combat with aircraft is less likely but possible. Allied patrol aircraft ranged over the convoy routes by March 1941, hunting U-boats caught on the surface. A sudden air attack could force a hasty dive or cause damage that led to later failure. However, no Allied aircraft reported attacking a U-boat in U-47's operating area on the relevant dates. What makes U-47's disappearance particularly frustrating for historians is the lack of physical evidence. The submarine sank somewhere in the deep Atlantic, beyond the reach of 1940s salvage technology. No wreckage was recovered, no bodies washed ashore. The ocean floor kept its secrets. Decades later, even modern sonar surveys have failed to locate the wreck. The loss of Prien and his crew was a blow to German morale. Prien was a national hero, his face on magazine covers, his exploits taught in naval academies. Losing him, without explanation, raised uncomfortable questions about U-boat vulnerability. If the most experienced commander could vanish without trace, what did that say about the risks facing less experienced crews? For the families of U-47's crew, the uncertainty was agonizing. Sons and husbands had gone to sea and never returned. The official notice said, missing, then, presumed lost, then simply lost. No grave, no confirmed battle, no witness to their final moments. Just the sea's silence and the arithmetic of probability. Allied analysts studied U-47's loss as part of the broader anti-submarine campaign. Depth charges, mines, and air patrols all contributed to U-boat attrition. Each loss confirmed or probable provided data. Tactics were refined. Convoy defenses were strengthened. The mystery of individual U-boats, like U-47, mattered less than the overall trend. U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. But for those who served aboard U-boats, the disappearances were deeply personal. Submariners understood the risks. They knew that a single mistake, a mechanical failure, a moment of bad luck could end in death, with no survivors and no story. The ocean was indifferent. The enemy was relentless, and the steel tube they lived in could become a tomb in seconds. U-47's final patrol became emblematic of the U-boat war's brutal mathematics. Crews hunted convoys, sank ships, and evaded counterattacks until they didn't. Some returned to port. Some were sunk with witnesses who reported their deaths, and some, like U-47, simply stopped transmitting and were never heard from again. The last message convoy cited. Attacking was typical of the terse, functional communication used by U-boats. No drama, no emotion, just position, target, intention. It was the kind of message sent hundreds of times by hundreds of boats throughout the war. For U-47, it was also the last. Günther Prien's name appears on memorials in Germany alongside other U-boat commanders who did not return. His final resting place is listed as at sea, a designation shared by thousands of submariners from all nations. The specifics of his death, whether by depth charge, mine, failure, or collision, remain unknown. The ocean that made him famous also claimed him, and it has not given him back. 45 men went down with U-47. Each had a name, a family, a reason for being there. They were mechanics, torpedomen, radio operators, engineers, specialists in the complex and dangerous work of submarine warfare. Their final moments are unknown. Whether they died instantly or had time to realize what was happening, whether the boat sank in darkness or light, whether they fought to escape or were killed before they could react, all of this is conjecture. What remains certain is that on March 7th, 1941, U-47 transmitted a message and then vanished. The war continued. Other boats took up the hunt. The Atlantic remained contested, and somewhere on the ocean floor, a steel cylinder holds 45 men, and the answer to a question that has never been conclusively answered. Story 5. Rudolf Hess flew alone. On May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, third in the party hierarchy, after Hitler and Goering climbed into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter and took off alone. He flew north across Germany, crossed the North Sea in darkness, and navigated by moonlight and dead reckoning towards Scotland. Near Eaglesham, south of Glasgow, he bailed out, parachuting into a farm field where he was immediately captured by a local farmer armed with a pitchfork. Hess identified himself, asked to meet the Duke of Hamilton, and claimed he had come on a mission of peace. The flight itself was a feat of navigation and endurance. The Bf 110 was a twin-engine fighter designed for combat, not long-range solo missions. Hess modified his aircraft with extra fuel tanks, stripped unnecessary equipment, and planned a route that avoided known anti-aircraft defenses. He flew without radio contact, relying on landmarks and a navigation map folded in his lap. The North Sea crossing at night, in a single-seat fighter, required precise piloting. A minor error in course or altitude could have sent him into the water or off course into occupied Norway. He succeeded. The aircraft ran out of fuel over Scotland. Hess parachuted safely. The plane crashed in a field, where it burned. Hess walked toward the nearest lights and surrendered to the first person he encountered. The news stunned both Germany and Britain. In Berlin, The Nazi leadership scrambled for an explanation. Hitler, reportedly furious, declared Hess mentally ill. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels issued a statement suggesting Hess had suffered hallucinations. The official line became, "Hess acted alone, without authorization, driven by delusions." His name was erased from party literature. His titles were reassigned. He became a non-person. In Britain, confusion reigned. Intelligence officers interrogated Hess repeatedly. He insisted he had come to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain, bypassing official channels to reach what he believed were sympathetic elements in the British aristocracy. He claimed Hitler wanted to focus on the Soviet Union and saw continued war with Britain as unnecessary and wasteful. He spoke of maps, plans, diplomatic initiatives, none of which he could substantiate with documents or credible contacts. British officials treated him as a prisoner of war and a curiosity. No peace negotiations were initiated. Hess was held in isolation, interrogated, observed, and eventually transferred to the Tower of London, then to secure facilities elsewhere. Churchill saw no value in negotiating with an unauthorized envoy from a hostile regime. The Duke of Hamilton, whom Hess had hoped to contact, denied any prior connection or communication. The central mystery of the Hess flight is motive. Why did the Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany undertake a solo, unauthorized flight to enemy territory in the middle of a war? Several theories have been proposed, none fully satisfying. The official German explanation that Hess was delusional was politically convenient but psychologically questionable. Hess had been a competent administrator and a trusted member of Hitler's inner circle for years. While he held mystical and eccentric views, there is no evidence he was clinically insane. His flight, though risky, was executed with planning and skill. Delusion does not explain the logistics. Hess's own explanation that he sought peace independently raises more questions than it answers. If he acted alone, why did he believe Britain would negotiate with a rogue Nazi official? If he had Hitler's tacit approval, why did Germany disown him so quickly and completely? Hess consistently maintained that he flew to prevent further bloodshed, but his narrative lacked coherent details about who in Britain would or could negotiate such a peace. A third theory suggests British intelligence lured Hess to Scotland through deception, feeding him false signals that sympathetic British figures were open to talks. This theory rests on fragmentary evidence and has been neither proven nor disproven. British intelligence files on Hess remain partially classified, fueling speculation that something was deliberately concealed. A fourth possibility is that Hess misunderstood Hitler's intentions or acted on outdated assumptions. Hitler had expressed interest in avoiding a two-front war and had occasionally spoken of Britain as a potential future ally against the Soviet Union. Hess may have interpreted these musings as approval for a peace initiative, failing to grasp that Hitler's strategic priorities had shifted. What complicates the mystery further is timing. Hess flew on May 10, 1941, just 6 weeks before Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22. The timing suggests Hess may have believed a rapprochement with Britain was urgent, either to secure Germany's western flank or to enable full focus on the coming Eastern campaign. Yet, if this was the motive, it implies a level of strategic awareness and planning that contradicts the delusional narrative. The British response to tension without negotiation effectively ended any diplomatic potential the flight might have had. Hess spent the rest of the war in British custody, then was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of crimes against peace, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served his sentence at Spandau Prison in Berlin until his death in 1987, at age 93, officially by suicide. But even his death raised questions. Hess hanged himself in a small garden summerhouse within Spandau, using an electrical cord. He was the prison's sole remaining inmate at the time. Some family members and conspiracy theorists questioned whether an elderly man in fragile health could have carried out the act alone, suggesting foul play. Autopsy results supported suicide, but doubts persisted. For historians, the Hess flight remains an interpretive puzzle. The basic facts are clear. He flew, he landed, he was captured, He spent decades in prison. But the why, the intent, the authorization, the expectations, is obscured by conflicting testimony, missing documents, and deliberate obfuscation by both German and British authorities. Hess himself offered little clarity. In interrogations, at Nuremberg, and in prison, he alternated between coherent statements and selective amnesia. At times, he claimed memory loss. At other times, he recounted details with precision. His motivations, as articulated by him, were idealistic. He wanted to stop the war, yet his actions were those of a man operating within Nazi ideology, loyal to Hitler, and committed to Germany's strategic goals. The flight also exposed the fragility of high-level wartime decision-making. A single individual, acting without formal coordination, could undertake a dramatic act that reverberated through multiple governments and intelligence agencies. The Nazis disowned him to preserve credibility. The British detained him to prevent embarrassment or exploitation. The truth became secondary to political necessity. For the families of those involved, the Hess affair was surreal. In Germany, Hess's wife and son faced public disgrace and suspicion. In Britain, officials dealt with the bizarre reality of a high-ranking enemy official arriving unannounced and unarmed, asking for diplomacy in the middle of total war. The aircraft that carried Hess to Scotland burned in a field, leaving wreckage that was eventually cleared and forgotten. The parachute, the maps, the fuel calculations, all became artifacts of a singular, inexplicable act. Hess himself became a historical footnote, famous not for what he achieved, but for what he attempted. What makes the Hess flight enduringly mysterious is its isolation. It was not part of a larger conspiracy, not a turning point in the war, not a strategic masterstroke. It was one man's decision, executed alone, with consequences that were immediate, profound, and ultimately futile. The war continued. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Britain fought on. Hess sat in a cell, and the question, why did he fly, remains unanswered in any definitive sense. The archives hold documents, interrogation transcripts, official statements, but they do not hold a complete, irrefutable explanation that resolves all contradictions. The mystery persists because the man at the center of it took his full story to the grave, leaving only fragments, claims, and the enduring image of a Nazi official parachuting into a Scottish field, asking for peace in a war that had no room for it. Story 6. The Amber Room, packed into crates. The Amber Room, located in the Catherine Palace outside Leningrad, was one of the most extraordinary works of decorative art in Europe. Its walls were covered in panels of amber fossilized resin, ranging in color from pale gold to deep red, backed with gold leaf and framed with mirrors. Assembled over decades in the 18th century, the room glowed when sunlight or candlelight hit the amber, casting warm, honeyed light across gilded surfaces. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth. In October 1941, German forces advancing on Leningrad reached Tsarskoye Selo. The Soviet evacuation of the palace's treasures had been incomplete. Many items were too large, too fragile, or too difficult to move in the chaos of retreat. The Amber Room presented particular problems. Amber is brittle. The panels were mounted on complex backing structures. Attempts to dismantle and evacuate the room risked destroying it. The Germans had no such hesitation. A team of German art experts, organized under the authority of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Nazi agency responsible for looting art and cultural property in occupied territories, arrived at the palace. They brought tools, crates, packing materials, and orders. Within approximately 36 hours, they dismantled the Amber Room. Panels were removed from the walls, packed into crates, and loaded onto trucks. The operation was efficient, methodical, and fast. The crates were shipped west to Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, the capital of East Prussia, where the amber was reassembled and displayed in Königsberg Castle. The room was exhibited as a trophy of conquest, a symbol of German cultural reclamation. For 3 years, the Amber Room remained in Königsberg, where it was viewed by German officials and visitors. Then the war turned. By early 1945, the Soviet Red Army was advancing into East Prussia. Königsberg, heavily fortified, came under siege. Bombing raids by Soviet and British aircraft hit the city repeatedly. Fires spread through districts. Buildings collapsed. The castle suffered damage. At some point, exact dates are unclear. The Amber Room was either moved, destroyed, or lost in the chaos. What happened next is unknown. Soviet forces captured Königsberg in April 1945. Investigators searched the ruined castle for the Amber Room. They found fragments, small pieces of amber, bits of frame, but not the panels themselves. No intact crates, no hidden storage, no clear trail. Theories multiplied in the absence of evidence. One possibility: the Amber Room was destroyed during the bombing and fires that consumed much of Königsberg in 1944 through 1945. Amber burns. If the panels were stored in the castle when fires broke out, they could have been incinerated, leaving only ash and fragments. This explanation is plausible, but unverified. No witnesses confirmed seeing the room burn. Another theory: the panels were evacuated from Königsberg before the Soviet advance and hidden elsewhere. Nazi officials were known to have moved, looted art as the front collapsed, sometimes burying treasures or storing them in mines, bunkers, and remote locations. The Amber Room, immensely valuable, might have been prioritized for evacuation, but if so, where? Decades of searches in mines, cellars, and underground facilities across Germany and Poland have yielded other treasures, but not the Amber Room. A third possibility: the room was loaded onto a ship for evacuation and sank. The Baltic Sea in early 1945 was crowded with refugee ships, military transports, and vessels fleeing the Soviet advance. Many were sunk by Soviet submarines, aircraft, or mines. If the Amber Room was aboard one of these ships, it rests on the sea floor. But no manifest, no testimony, no archival document conclusively places the amber aboard any specific vessel. A fourth theory, less credible but persistent: the panels survived the war and were hidden deliberately by individuals who intended to sell or preserve them. Rumors of private collectors, secret sales, and hidden caches have circulated for decades. None have been substantiated with physical evidence. What makes the Amber Room's disappearance particularly haunting is its nature as an object. Unlike documents or data, which can be copied or reconstructed, the Amber Room was unique, irreplaceable panels, assembled by artisans who took years to complete the work. If destroyed, it cannot be truly recovered. If hidden, it degrades in storage. Amber is sensitive to temperature and humidity. Time works against it. The Soviet Union and later Russia conducted extensive searches. Investigators interviewed German prisoners of war, examined archives, excavated sites. Leads were followed. Rumors investigated. Hope flickered with each reported sighting, then faded when the trail went cold. The search consumed resources, time, and emotion, a national treasure lost, a wound that would not close. In the 1970s, the Soviet government authorized the creation of a replica Amber Room, reconstructing the panels using historical photographs, surviving fragments, and traditional techniques. The work took decades. Artisans sourced amber from the same Baltic regions, studied 18th century methods, and painstakingly recreated the lost masterpiece. The new Amber Room was completed in 2003 and installed in the Catherine Palace, where the original once stood. The replica is beautiful. It glows with the same warm light. Visitors photograph it, marvel at it, and walk through a space that looks like the lost room. But it is not the original. It is memory-made material, an acknowledgement that the real panels are gone, their fate unknown. For historians and art recovery specialists, the Amber Room represents a category of wartime loss that defies resolution. Some looted art was recovered, some was destroyed and documented. The Amber Room falls into neither category. It vanished into the fog of war's final chaotic months, and the fog never lifted. Families of those who worked on the original panels, or who saw it before the war, carry memories of the room as it was. They describe the light, the texture, the sense of being inside something alive. Those memories cannot be archived or quantified. They exist only in testimony, in the fading recollections of a generation that touched the amber before it disappeared. The mystery endures because every theory fits some facts, but none fit all. Burned? Possibly. Hidden? Perhaps. Sunk? Maybe. Sold? Unlikely, but not impossible. The lack of definitive evidence allows each possibility to remain open, each search to continue. In 1997, German police recovered a single panel, a small mosaic work that had been part of the original room during an investigation into stolen art. The panel had been taken by a German soldier during the war, kept hidden for decades, and eventually offered for sale. Its recovery proved that at least some fragments survived, but one panel is not the room, and its discovery only deepened the question. If this piece survived, where are the rest? The Amber Room's loss also highlights the broader phenomenon of cultural destruction in wartime. Art, architecture, libraries, objects of immense cultural value are fragile in conflict. They can be looted, destroyed, or lost in ways that erase centuries of human achievement in hours. The Nazis looted systematically, the Soviets lost systematically, and the result, decades later, is a world still searching for what was taken. The crates left Tsarskoye Selo in 1941, packed with amber panels that had glowed for 2 centuries. They arrived in Königsberg, were unpacked, and briefly shone again. Then the war closed in. Fires burned. Buildings fell. And somewhere in that collapse, the Amber Room disappeared. Searches continue. Archival research proceeds. Sonar scans probe Baltic wrecks. And the question remains, where is the amber? Is it dust or treasure? Is it buried or burned? The room exists now only as replica, photograph, and memory. The original is missing, and after 80 years, missing is all it may ever be. Story: 7 HMAS Sydney. No survivors, only silence. HMAS Sydney II was a modified Leander-class light cruiser, 562 feet long, displacing over 7,000 tons, armed with 8 6-inch guns and smaller anti-aircraft batteries. She had a distinguished record. In July 1940, Sydney fought and sank the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni in the Mediterranean, a victory celebrated across Australia. She returned to Australian waters in 1941 for escort and patrol duties. Her crew numbered 645 men. On November 19, 1941, Sydney was steaming alone off the coast of Western Australia when she encountered another vessel. The ship appeared to be a merchant Dutch, flying neutral colors, moving slowly. Sydney approached to investigate, following standard procedure for inspecting unknown vessels in wartime waters. The merchant ship was Cormoran, a German auxiliary cruiser, a warship disguised as a civilian freighter. Hidden behind false panels were guns, torpedoes, and a trained combat crew. Cormoran's purpose was to ambush Allied shipping, relying on deception to close range before revealing her weapons. Sydney closed to within a mile, possibly less. At that range, Cormoran dropped her disguise and opened fire. The engagement was brutal and short. Cormoran's guns, designed for exactly this kind of surprise attack, hit Sydney repeatedly. Shells struck the cruiser's bridge, communications equipment, and forward gun turrets. Fires broke out. Sydney returned fire, hitting Cormoran hard enough to cripple her propulsion and start fires aboard the German ship. Both vessels were burning. Both were damaged. Sydney turned away, trailing smoke, her silhouette visible against the late afternoon sky. Cormoran, unable to pursue, watched the Australian cruiser disappear over the horizon. The Germans assumed Sydney would limp toward port, or at least send a distress signal. She did neither. Sydney vanished. Hours later, Cormoran's crew, unable to control the fires, abandoned ship. The raider sank. German sailors took to lifeboats and rafts, drifting in the Indian Ocean. Over the next several days, Australian search aircraft and ships found the survivors 318 Germans, some injured, all exhausted. They were picked up, interrogated, and interned. They reported the battle. They described Sydney's damage and her departure from the scene, but they had not seen her sink, and Sydney had not radioed for help. Search operations began immediately. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the ocean. Ships crisscrossed the search area. Nothing. No wreckage. No lifeboats. No survivors. No bodies. No debris field. No oil slick that would mark a sunken ship's grave. Days became weeks. The searches continued, expanding in radius, checking currents and drift patterns. Still nothing. Sydney and her 645 men had simply disappeared. The loss shocked Australia. A major warship, lost without trace, without survivors, without even a confirmed sinking location. Families waited for news. None came. The government issued statements acknowledging the loss, but offering no details beyond the German account. The mystery deepened public grief. How could a ship disappear so completely? The German survivors provided the only narrative. Their testimony, recorded in interrogations, described the encounter from Cormoran's perspective. Sydney had approached incautiously. Cormoran had fired first, achieving surprise. The exchange of fire was intense. Sydney had been hit multiple times, but remained afloat when last seen. Cormoran's crew had assumed the Australian ship would reach port, or at least survive long enough to signal. But critics questioned the German account. Why had Sydney closed to such short range? Wartime protocols emphasized caution when inspecting unknown ships. Why had she not maintained a safer distance? Had her captain misjudged the threat? Or had Cormoran's disguise been so convincing that Sydney relaxed her guard? And why had Sydney not radioed a distress call? Even if the bridge was hit early, radio equipment was distributed across the ship. Secondary transmitters should have been functional. A single message under attack, taking fire, position would have alerted Australian Naval Command and triggered immediate response. Yet no such message was received. Sydney went into battle and went silent. The lack of survivors compounded the mystery. In most naval engagements, even ships that sank quickly produced some survivors, men who abandoned ship, clung to wreckage, or reached lifeboats. Sydney carried rafts and boats. Her crew was trained in abandonment procedures, yet not a single man survived to tell the Australian side of the story. The absence of wreckage was equally baffling. Ships do not vanish. They sink, and when they sink, they leave debris, wood, oil, personal effects, flotsam. Search grids were thorough. Aircraft covered thousands of square miles. Surface ships investigated every reported sighting. They found nothing. Theories emerged to explain the silence. Perhaps Sydney sank quickly, going down before lifeboats could be launched. Perhaps the crew, trapped by fire and damage, went down with the ship. Perhaps the location was farther from the search area than estimated, and wreckage drifted beyond the grid. Perhaps sharks, common in those waters, accounted for the absence of bodies, but none of these explanations fully satisfied. Quick sinking did not explain the lack of debris. Trapped crew did not explain the absence of a distress signal. Miscalculated search areas seemed implausible given the resources committed, and while sharks were a grim reality, they did not explain why no wreckage, wood, metal, fabric was ever found. Decades passed. The loss of HMAS Sydney became a national tragedy, commemorated in memorials and remembered in military histories. But the mystery persisted. Families of the lost men wanted answers. Where had their sons and husbands died? How had they died? Why had no one survived to bear witness? In 2008, after years of searching, the wreck of HMAS Sydney was finally located off the Western Australian coast, roughly 110 nautical miles from where Cormoran sank. The discovery, made using advanced sonar and underwater survey technology, ended part of the mystery. The ship's position was now known. The wreck confirmed she had sunk, but it did not answer all the questions. Examination of the wreck showed extensive damage. Sydney had been hit hard fires, explosions, structural failures. The damage supported the German account of a fierce and destructive engagement, but The wreck also raised new questions. Why had the ship traveled so far from the battle site before sinking? Had the crew attempted to reach port? Had flooding been gradual, allowing the ship to stay afloat for hours? Or had she drifted, abandoned, before finally going under? The absence of survivors remained unexplained. The wreck showed no evidence that would definitively account for total crew loss. Lifeboats appeared to have been deployed. Evidence suggested some were launched. Yet no one reached shore. No one was found. The sea had swallowed 645 men and left no trace. Forensic analysis of the wreck and German testimony produced a probable timeline. Sydney closed, too near Cormoran, was ambushed, suffered catastrophic damage to command and control systems, fought back but failed to disable the enemy completely, broke off heavily damaged, attempted to reach port or at least open water, and sank hours later from cumulative flooding and fire. The crew likely abandoned ship, but lifeboats in those waters faced extreme challenges: distance from land, heat, dehydration, sharks. Survival time would have been limited. If no ships passed nearby, no aircraft spotted them, they would have died at sea. This timeline fits the known facts, but it remains a reconstruction, not a certainty. No Australian voice confirms it. No diary, no message, no survivor's account provides the missing perspective. The wreck is evidence. German testimony is evidence. But the story of Sydney's final hours remains incomplete. The loss of HMAS Sydney is one of the largest maritime mysteries of the Second World War. A modern warship with a trained crew and functioning systems engaged an enemy, suffered damage, and vanished with all hands. The battle itself lasted minutes. The aftermath, searches, investigations, speculation lasted decades. And even with the wreck found, essential questions linger. 645 men went to sea. None came home. The ocean holds their ship, but it has not given back the full story. Story 8: Pearl Harbor. Warnings that did not become readiness. December 7th, 1941, was a Sunday at Pearl Harbor, the United States Pacific Fleet's main base in Hawaii. Ships rode at anchor, in neat rows along Battleship Row and around Ford Island. Crew members ate breakfast, wrote letters, slept in. Shore leave had been granted to thousands of sailors and soldiers. The base operated on peacetime Sunday schedules, minimal watches, relaxed alert levels. Maintenance deferred to Monday. At 7:02 in the morning, 2 United States Army radar operators at Opana Point, on Oahu's northern coast, detected an unusually large blip on their screen. The contact was over 130 miles out, inbound, and growing. They reported it to the information center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty, informed of the contact, made a judgment call. It was probably a flight of American B-17 bombers expected to arrive from the mainland. He told the operators not to worry about it. The contact was not B-17s. At 7:55 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 183 planes, launched from 6 aircraft carriers, 230 miles north of Oahu, struck Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters swept over the harbor in coordinated attack. Bombs fell. Torpedoes ripped into battleship hulls. Explosions erupted across the anchorage. Ships listed, burned, capsized. Men scrambled to battle stations, many still in pajamas or shore uniforms. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the surprise was total. By the time the attack ended, 2 hours later, the damage was catastrophic. 8 battleships were hit, 4 sunk, 4 damaged, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels were damaged or sunk. 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2,403 Americans were killed. 1,178 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet, intended to deter Japanese aggression, was crippled. The attack itself was a tactical masterpiece, carefully planned, flawlessly executed, overwhelmingly successful. But it was not unpredictable. The warning signs were there. And that fact has fueled debate and investigation for over 80 years. In the months leading up to December 7th, United States intelligence agencies had collected a massive amount of information, indicating rising tensions with Japan. Diplomatic relations were deteriorating. Economic sanctions imposed by the United States in response to Japan's expansion in China and Southeast Asia had pushed the Japanese government toward crisis. Negotiations in Washington had stalled. Japanese fleet movements were tracked. Communication intercepts were analyzed. American codebreakers had partially broken Japanese diplomatic codes. Messages between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington revealed a breakdown in talks and preparations for some kind of action. In late November, a message instructed the embassy to destroy code machines and burn documents, standard procedure, before conflict. Yet, the specific target and timing of an attack were not spelled out in the intercepts available to United States intelligence. Military intelligence officers noted the disappearance of Japanese aircraft carriers from tracked positions. The carriers, normally monitored through radio traffic analysis, went silent in late November. Their location became unknown, a significant and troubling gap. Some analysts suspected they were preparing for operations. But where? The Philippines? Malaya? Hawaii seemed less likely, too distant, too heavily defended, too risky. Warnings were issued. On November 27th, the War Department sent alerts to Pacific commanders, including Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, commander of Army forces in Hawaii. The messages warned that negotiations with Japan appeared to be ending and that an aggressive move was expected. They ordered defensive preparations and instructed commanders to avoid actions that might provoke an incident. But the warnings were vague. They did not specify Hawaii as a likely target. They did not convey the urgency that might have triggered full-scale alert, and they assumed that local commanders, receiving the alerts, would implement appropriate defensive measures. Admiral Kimmel and General Short read the warnings and made decisions based on their interpretation of the threat. Kimmel focused on the risk of sabotage from Hawaii's large Japanese-American population, ordering ships to be clustered for easier protection against infiltrators. Short implemented sabotage precautions, which included parking aircraft in tight groups on airfields, making them easier to guard, but also easier to destroy in an air attack. Neither commander ordered full readiness. Reconnaissance flights remained limited. Anti-aircraft crews were not on full alert. The fleet stayed in port, not dispersed. The decisions were not irrational given the information available to them. Sabotage was considered a real risk. The warnings from Washington emphasized the threat of war but did not point conclusively at Hawaii. And peacetime routines, budget constraints, and operational norms all pushed against maintaining high alert indefinitely. But the Japanese were coming. The morning radar contact at 7:02 in the morning was the last chance. Had the officer at Fort Shafter taken the report seriously? Had he escalated it to Fleet Command? Had fighters been scrambled or ships been alerted? The attack might have been disrupted, not prevented. The Japanese force was too large, too committed but blunted. Ships could have raised steam. Aircraft could have been dispersed. Anti-aircraft crews could have been at stations. Instead, the blip was dismissed. The bombers came, and the base was caught utterly unprepared. The aftermath brought investigations. Multiple inquiries examined what went wrong. Congressional committees, military boards, and historians pored over messages, logs, decisions, and timelines. The findings were damning in some respects, complex in others. Failures at every level contributed to the disaster. Washington had intelligence, but failed to synthesize it into actionable warning. Messages were drafted vaguely. Critical information did not reach commanders in Hawaii in time. Local commanders interpreted warnings through the lens of their most immediate concerns: sabotage, peacetime routine, and failed to anticipate an air attack. The radar contact was reported and dismissed a failure of judgment, compounded by lack of clear protocols for handling unexpected contacts. The B-17s were expected, and the officer assumed the radar had detected them. No standing order required verification or escalation of such reports. The system depended on individual judgment, and in this case, judgment failed. The mystery is not whether warnings existed, they did. The mystery is why those warnings did not translate into readiness. Why did information fail to move from intelligence analysts to decision-makers in time? Why did commanders in Hawaii, receiving alerts about potential conflict, not implement higher defensive postures? Why did a radar detection 130 miles out fail to trigger action? Part of the answer lies in organizational failures. Intelligence was fragmented across agencies: Army, Navy, State Department, each holding pieces, but none seeing the complete picture. Communication between Washington and Hawaii was slow. Messages sent by telegraph took hours to decode and deliver. The most critical intercepts were analyzed in Washington, but not immediately shared with Pacific commanders. Another part lies in cognitive bias. Hawaii seemed unlikely as a target. The Japanese were expected to move south, into the Philippines or Malaya, where resources and strategic value were clearer. An attack on Hawaii, while theoretically possible, struck many analysts as too risky for Japan. Distance, logistics, the strength of the Pacific Fleet all argued against it, and so the possibility was discounted, even as evidence accumulated. A third factor was peacetime mindset. The United States was not at war in early December 1941. Readiness levels reflected that. Budgets, schedules, and routines were calibrated for deterrence and preparation, not imminent conflict. Full alert was expensive, exhausting, and difficult to sustain. Commanders balanced caution with practicality, and in this case, practicality won. The Japanese, meanwhile, had planned meticulously. They studied Pearl Harbor's layout, rehearsed torpedo attacks in shallow water, trained pilots for months, and maintained strict radio silence during the approach. They bet everything on surprise, and they achieved it. The attack succeeded because systems failed: intelligence systems, communication systems, command systems. Individual decisions, made under uncertainty and pressure, compounded into collective catastrophe. No single person bore sole responsibility. No single message, if acted upon differently, would have prevented the attack. The failure was systemic. For families of the 2,403 killed, the explanations offered little comfort. Sons and husbands had died in an attack that might have been blunted if only someone somewhere had connected the dots. The warnings had existed, the radar had worked, the enemy had been detected, and yet the bombs still fell. In the decades since, Pearl Harbor has been studied as a case in intelligence failure, organizational dysfunction, and the fog of peace turning into the shock of war. The lessons learned reshaped how the United States handles intelligence, how commanders assess threats, how systems are designed to escalate warnings. But the core mystery, how a nation could have so much information and still be caught so utterly by surprise, remains a humbling lesson. Information is not understanding, detection is not readiness, and warnings, no matter how clear in hindsight, are only as effective as the systems and people who receive them. The morning of December 7th began with routine and ended in flames. The warnings had been there, the future had been visible, and yet it arrived unrecognized until it was too late. Story 9. The Normandie burned in New York. SS Normandie was, in peacetime, one of the grandest ocean liners afloat, a French flagship, 1,029 feet long, capable of carrying over 2,000 passengers across the Atlantic in Art Deco luxury. Her maiden voyage in 1935 set speed records. Her interiors featured murals, grand staircases, gilded dining halls. She was a symbol of French elegance and engineering. When France fell in 1940, Normandie was docked in New York. The United States, still neutral, interned the ship. After Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy seized her for conversion into a troop transport. Renamed USS Lafayette, she was to carry 15,000 soldiers across oceans, stripped of luxury and refitted for war. On February 9, 1942, Workers swarmed the ship. Welders, fitters, laborers, civilian contractors hired to accelerate the conversion. The interior was being gutted. Grand salons became open troop decks. Furniture, fixtures, and fittings were torn out. Sparks flew. Torches cut. Hammers rang. Just after 2:30 in the afternoon, fire broke out. The blaze started in the first-class lounge, where workers were using cutting torches near stacks of life preservers. The preservatives were flammable. Sparks ignited them. Flames spread to wood, paneling, upholstery, and debris. Within minutes, smoke filled compartments. Workers scrambled for exits. The fire alarm sounded. The New York City Fire Department responded immediately, sending dozens of companies. Fireboats converged on Pier 88. Hoses were deployed. Water poured into the burning liner, but the fire had momentum. Fed by combustible materials and confined spaces, it roared through decks, climbing bulkheads, consuming what had once been luxury. Hours passed. The fire grew. More water was pumped aboard thousands of gallons per minute. The ship began to list. Weight from the water, concentrated high in the superstructure, destabilized her. Engineers warned of capsizing risk. Pumping continued. By evening, Normandy was visibly leaning. The list increased 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. Just after midnight, she rolled over and settled on her side in the shallow berth, half submerged, her massive hull blocking the pier like a fallen monument. The fire was out. The ship was ruined. One man died in the blaze, a worker overcome by smoke. But the loss was more than human. Normandy, intended to carry armies, was now a useless wreck. Salvage would take over a year. By the time she was righted and refloated, the war had moved on. She was scrapped in 1946, her steel recycled, her elegance gone. The fire raised immediate questions. Was it sabotage? The timing early in America's war, at a critical shipyard, fed suspicion. Normandy was a high-profile target. Saboteurs, whether Axis agents or sympathizers, could cripple conversion efforts and send a message. Rumors spread quickly. Investigators descended. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, Naval Intelligence, and New York Police examined the wreck, interviewed workers, and reviewed security. The official conclusion: accident, not sabotage. The fire started from careless use of a cutting torch near flammable materials. The life preservers, stored improperly, ignited. The blaze spread because safety protocols were inadequate. Fire watches were insufficient. Fire suppression systems were offline during conversion, and combustible materials were not properly stored or protected. The disaster was the result of haste, poor coordination, and neglect of basic fire safety. But the sabotage rumors persisted. Some pointed to the speed of the fire's spread too fast, too intense to be purely accidental. Others noted security lapses at the pier, the mixed workforce of contractors, and the potential for infiltration. The fact that the ship capsized added to the suspicion had the flooding been deliberate, designed to sink her under cover of firefighting. No evidence supported sabotage. Investigations found no incendiary devices, no tampering with equipment, no credible suspects. The fire's origin was traced to the lounge, where workers had been torch cutting. Witnesses confirmed the sequence: sparks, smoke, panic. The capsizing resulted from firefighting efforts, not sabotage water weight, not bombs or scuttling charges. Yet doubt lingered. The war had made everyone suspicious. Every accident looked like potential enemy action. And because the ship was a total loss, because salvage took so long, because the conversion program suffered a major setback, the question, could it have been sabotage, never fully disappeared. For historians, the Normandy fire exemplifies the challenge of distinguishing accident from intent in wartime. Sabotage is always plausible. Accidents are always possible. And in the absence of definitive proof, both explanations coexist. The physical facts support accident. The timeline, the materials, The conditions all align with an industrial fire caused by unsafe practices. But the emotional and strategic context supports suspicion. A major asset, destroyed. A symbolic blow, a lingering doubt. The families of workers who died, the sailors who would have sailed aboard her, the city that watched her burn, all carried their own interpretations. For some, it was a tragic accident, a preventable disaster born of wartime urgency and corner-cutting. For others, it was enemy action disguised as mishap, a hidden hand striking at America's war effort. The conversion of luxury liners into troop ships was a massive undertaking across Allied ports. These vessels, built for comfort, speed, and civilian service, had to be gutted and reconfigured in months. Staterooms became troop berths, dining halls became mess decks, promenades became storage. The work was rushed, conducted by civilian contractors under Navy supervision, with schedules that prioritized speed over safety. Normandie's fire exposed the risks. Flammable materials stored haphazardly, welding and cutting performed near combustibles, fire watches inadequate or absent, suppression systems disabled during construction. The combination was lethal. Once ignited, the fire found fuel everywhere: wood, fabric, paint, insulation. The firefighting response, though massive, made things worse. Pumping thousands of tons of water into a ship's upper decks violated basic principles of naval architecture. Ships are designed with ballast low and weight distributed. Flooding the superstructure concentrated weight high, creating top heaviness. As the list increased, water ran to the low side, accelerating the roll. Engineers on scene recognized the danger but faced an impossible choice: stop pumping and let the fire rage, or continue and risk capsizing. They continued. The ship rolled. The capsized hull became a symbol of homefront vulnerability. New York Harbor, supposedly secure, had lost a major asset, not to enemy torpedo or bomb, but to fire on a pier. The image of Normandie lying on her side, half submerged, appeared in newspapers nationwide. It was embarrassing. It was demoralizing. And it demanded explanation. Investigations proceeded methodically. The Navy convened boards of inquiry. The Federal Bureau of Investigation interviewed hundreds of workers. Records were examined: manifests, work orders, timesheets, security logs. Every lead was followed. The conclusion remained: accident. But the absence of sabotage evidence is not the same as proof of absence. Investigators could demonstrate what likely happened: sparks, fire, poor safety, but they could not prove a negative. They could not definitively rule out a carefully executed act of sabotage designed to look like accident. And so the mystery, if it can be called that, rests not on what happened, but on what might have happened. The facts point to accident. The context permits suspicion, and the gap between the two has never fully closed. The Normandy fire also illuminated broader truths about wartime production and security. The home front was not a safe rear area. It was a zone of industrial mobilization where haste, pressure, and risk produced their own casualties. Workers died in shipyards, factories, and docks from accidents that peacetime would have prevented. Ships burned, buildings collapsed, explosives detonated. Some incidents were sabotage, most were not. Distinguishing between them required investigation, evidence, and judgment. And even then, certainty was elusive. For the workers who survived the fire, the memory was visceral. The heat, the smoke, the scramble through unfamiliar corridors in a ship being torn apart, the shouts, the confusion, the realization that the great liner was dying. They had come to build a troop ship. They had witnessed its destruction. The salvage operation, begun in 1943, was a feat of engineering. The capsized hull had to be stabilized, sealed, and gradually righted using winches, pontoons, and controlled flooding. Workers cut away wreckage, pumped out compartments, and restored buoyancy section by section. The work took 18 months. When Normandie finally floated upright again, she was a gutted shell, rusted and ruined, beyond economical repair. She was towed away and scrapped, Her steel went into the war effort, recycled into weapons, ships, vehicles. The Art Deco fittings, the grand staircases, the murals, all were lost. What remained were photographs, memories, and the questions that never fully resolved. Was it sabotage? The evidence says no. Could it have been? The circumstances permit maybe. And in that gap between evidence and possibility, the Normandy fire remains a study in how wartime anxiety shapes interpretation. Every disaster became suspect. Every accident carried the shadow of enemy intent. And even when investigations concluded otherwise, doubt persisted. The ship burned. The ship capsized. A man died. A symbol was lost. And the home front learned that the war could reach even the safest harbors. Not always through enemy action, but through the pressures and failures of mobilization itself. Story 10. The Battle of Los Angeles. On the night of February 24th through 25th, 1942, air raid sirens wailed across Los Angeles. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping the dark sky. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned on rooftops, in parks, along the coast, swung toward unseen targets. For the next hour, gunners fired approximately 1,430 shells into the night sky over one of America's largest cities. They were shooting at nothing confirmed. The alert began with radar contacts and nervous reports. It was less than 3 months after Pearl Harbor. The West Coast was on edge. Japanese submarines had shelled installations in California. Invasion fears ran high. Every unidentified blip, every shadow, every distant sound triggered alarm. Just after midnight, radar stations detected objects offshore. Reports came in, something approaching, altitude uncertain, speed variable. The information was fragmentary, contradictory. Some stations tracked contacts, others saw nothing. Coastal observers reported seeing lights. The Regional Air Defense Command weighed the data and made a decision. Possible enemy aircraft inbound. Sound the alert. Across Los Angeles, blackout procedures took effect. Lights went dark. Civilians moved to shelters. Civil defense wardens patrolled streets, enforcing the blackout. And the anti-aircraft crews manned their guns, waiting for orders. The order came. Open fire. Shells burst across the sky. Bright flashes against the darkness. Searchlights crisscrossed, hunting targets. Shrapnel rained down on neighborhoods below, spent fragments of shells, falling like metal hail. Residents crouched in homes, listening to the thunder of guns. Watching the sky light up, the barrage continued for over an hour. Gunners fired at coordinates, called out by observers, at searchlight illuminations, at radar-designated zones. Some reported seeing objects in the beams, dark shapes, possibly aircraft. Others saw nothing but smoke and shell bursts. When the all-clear sounded, the city emerged into a dawn littered with shrapnel and questions. What had they been shooting at? No bombs had fallen. No enemy aircraft wreckage was found. No confirmed sightings of Japanese planes were substantiated. The only casualties were from the barrage itself, several civilians killed by falling shrapnel and anti-aircraft shell fragments, others injured. Property damage came from friendly fire shells falling on buildings, cars, streets. Official explanations shifted. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, initially called it a false alarm, attributable to jittery nerves. The Army insisted there had been unidentified aircraft, possibly 15 or more, and that the response was justified. Conflicting statements fueled public confusion and anger. Investigations followed. What had the radar detected? What had observers seen? Why had the response been so overwhelming if the threat was uncertain? The most plausible explanation, assembled from later analysis, was a combination of factors: war nerves, misidentified objects, and cascading confusion. The initial radar contacts may have been weather balloons, released earlier by the military for meteorological purposes. Once the alert was sounded and guns began firing, the smoke and shell bursts created new targets, gunners firing at their own explosions, observers seeing shapes in drifting smoke. Searchlights picked up objects, possibly balloons, possibly birds, possibly atmospheric phenomena, and gunners engaged. The result was a feedback loop. Firing created smoke. Smoke created sightings. Sightings justified more firing. The barrage became self-sustaining, driven by adrenaline, uncertainty, and the conviction that the enemy must be there because the alert had been called. But alternative explanations persisted. Some believed the objects were real, unidentified aircraft, whether enemy or unknown. UFO theories emerged decades later, citing the event as evidence of non-terrestrial visitation. Conspiracy theories suggested government cover-up, suppression of the true nature of the encounter. The archival record supports the false alarm interpretation. No physical evidence of enemy aircraft was recovered. Japanese records, examined after the war, showed no operations over Los Angeles that night. The objects tracked on radar were likely benign balloons, weather phenomena, or equipment anomalies. The engagement was friendly fire against phantoms, yet the mystery endures, not because the evidence is ambiguous, but because the event was so visceral. Thousands of people witnessed the barrage. They heard the guns. They saw the searchlights and explosions. They felt the shrapnel fall. Their experience was real, even if the threat was not. For those who lived through it, the Battle of Los Angeles was terrifying. The war had come home. The sky was full of fire. Civilians died. And when the all-clear sounded, no satisfying explanation was immediately offered. Official confusion, one agency calling it false alarm, another insisting on real targets, eroded trust. The incident also revealed the fragility of early air defense systems. Radar was new, imperfect, and poorly understood. Operators misread screens. Atmospheric conditions created false returns. Communication between radar, command, and gun crews was slow and prone to error. The integrated systems that would later coordinate air defense did not yet exist. In 1942, air defense was reactive, chaotic, and vulnerable to cascading mistakes. The psychological dimension mattered as much as the technical. The West Coast in early 1942 was genuinely under threat. Japanese submarines operated offshore. Shelling attacks had occurred. Invasion, while unlikely, was not impossible. Civil defense drills emphasized readiness. The public was told to expect attacks. Fear was rational. In that context, an ambiguous radar contact became an enemy raid. Uncertain sightings became confirmed targets. The desire to defend, to respond, to do something, overcame caution. Gunners fired because they believed the threat was real. Commanders ordered the barrage because the cost of doing nothing, if the enemy was truly there, seemed unacceptable. The aftermath was uncomfortable. Civilians demanded accountability. Why had they been endangered by their own defenses? Why had the story changed? What had really been in the sky? The military tightened procedures. Radar operators received better training. Coordination between observation posts, command centers, and gun batteries improved. The incident became a case study in what not to do, a lesson in the importance of verification, communication, and restraint. But for historians, the Battle of Los Angeles exemplifies a broader wartime phenomenon: how fear shapes perception, and how perception shapes action. The guns fired at something. Whether that something was balloons, smoke, or imagination, the response was real. Shells were expended. Lives were lost. A city was shaken. The mystery, such as it is, lies not in the absence of explanation, but in the persistence of doubt. Official records say false alarm. Witnesses remember fire in the sky, and the gap between documentation and experience leaves room for questions that facts alone cannot close. No enemy attacked Los Angeles that night, but the city went to war against the darkness, and the darkness did not answer back. Story 11L8. The Ghost Blimp. L8 was a United States Navy patrol blimp, one of dozens used for coastal anti-submarine surveillance during the war. At 250 feet long, filled with helium, powered by 2 engines, it could cruise for hours at low altitude, scanning the ocean for periscopes, oil slicks, or surfaced U-boats. The crew was small: 2 men, Lieutenant Ernest Cody, pilot, and Ensign Charles Adams, co-pilot. On the morning of August 16, 1942, L-8 lifted off from Treasure Island Naval Air Station in San Francisco Bay on a routine patrol. The mission was straightforward: fly a designated search pattern along the coast, investigate any contacts, return before noon. Weather was clear, visibility good. The blimp carried standard equipment: radio, binoculars, flares, and a single small depth charge. At around 7:50 in the morning, L-8 reported investigating an oil slick near the Farallon Islands, about 30 miles west of San Francisco. The radio message was brief and routine. Fishing vessels in the area saw the blimp circling, descending for a closer look. Then it climbed and moved away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Cody and Adams. Hours later, around 11 in the morning, L-8 was seen drifting inland, apparently unmanned. It passed over the coast, losing altitude gradually, trailing a mooring line. Witnesses on the ground watched it approach. The blimp descended slowly, bouncing off a beach, then rising again. It drifted over Daly City, just south of San Francisco, and finally came down in a street, deflating partially as it settled. Civilians and police rushed to the wreck. They found the cockpit empty. No crew, no bodies, no signs of struggle or violence. The blimp's equipment was largely intact: radio functional, fuel tanks full, controls in neutral. Personal items remained aboard: jackets, hats, paperwork. The depth charge was still secured. The life raft was still aboard. But Cody and Adams were gone. Search operations began immediately. Coast Guard cutters scoured the waters where L-8 had reported the oil slick. Aircraft flew grid patterns. Shore patrols checked beaches. The search area expanded over days, covering hundreds of square miles. No trace of the men was found. No bodies, no wreckage, no indication of what had happened. The Navy launched an investigation. The blimp was examined. Flight logs, radio transmissions, and equipment were reviewed. Witnesses were interviewed: fishermen who saw the blimp near the Farallons, civilians who watched it drift ashore. The evidence was assembled. The timeline was reconstructed, and yet no explanation emerged that could account for both men disappearing without trace while leaving the blimp intact and airborne. Theories multiplied, each attempting to reconcile the facts. Accident overboard was one possibility. If both men leaned out to observe the oil slick, perhaps investigating a potential submarine contact, they could have fallen. But blimps are not fighter planes. The gondola is enclosed. Falling out requires opening a door and losing balance. For both men to fall, simultaneously or in quick succession, without securing the blimp or radioing distress, strained plausibility. Suicide was considered and dismissed. There was no evidence of distress, no motive, no note, no prior indication, and a joint suicide by jumping from a blimp during a routine patrol defied logic. Enemy action was another theory. A surfaced submarine could have confronted the blimp, forcing the crew to abandon or be captured, but no German or Japanese submarine reported such an encounter. And if the blimp had been attacked, why was it undamaged? Why was the depth charge still aboard? Why did the radio show no distress call? Mechanical failure leading to evacuation seemed unlikely. The blimp was functional when it came down. The engines worked. The controls responded. If the crew had faced an emergency requiring bailout, they would have used the life raft, which was still aboard. They would have radioed. They would have left evidence of crisis. There was none. Foul play, murder, or sabotage was considered but lacked supporting evidence. The crew had no known enemies. The blimp showed no signs of tampering. And who would benefit from killing 2 patrol aircrew on a routine mission? The most persistent question was why the blimp remained airborne. If both men left the gondola, however they left, the blimp should have behaved erratically, without a pilot. Yet witnesses described it drifting steadily, maintaining altitude for a time, descending gradually. The controls were found in neutral, suggesting someone had set them before departing. But why? One speculative scenario involved a rescue attempt gone wrong. If the crew saw someone in distress in the water, a pilot from a downed aircraft, a sailor from a sunken ship, they might have descended to help. Perhaps they deployed the life raft and entered the water. Perhaps the blimp, lighter without their weight, rose and drifted away before they could reboard. Perhaps they drowned or were carried off by currents. This theory fits some facts. It explains the neutral controls, the intact equipment, the absence of struggle. But it requires that both men left the blimp, that neither radioed for backup, and that both disappeared without leaving recoverable remains. And it does not explain why fishing vessels near the Farallones saw the blimp circling but reported no distress, no people in the water, no rescue attempt. Another scenario involved a sudden medical emergency pilot incapacitation, followed by the co-pilot's failed attempt to revive him and a hasty decision to bail out. But this too requires improbable sequences. Why not radio? Why not use the raft? Why abandon a functional aircraft? The simplest explanation is an accident. One man fell or jumped. The other attempted rescue and also fell. But the evidence for this is thin. The blimp's slow drift, the neutral controls, the intact equipment all suggest deliberate actions, not panic or sudden loss. No wreckage of the men was ever found. No bodies washed ashore in the days or weeks following. The ocean gave nothing back. The investigation concluded with no definitive finding. The official report listed the cause as undetermined. Cody and Adams were declared missing, then presumed dead. Families were left with absence. 2 men lifted off on a routine patrol and never returned. Their aircraft came back without them, as if they had simply stepped out mid-flight and vanished. For the Navy, L8 became a cautionary tale and a morale problem. Blimps were supposed to be safe, reliable, routine. Losing a crew under mysterious circumstances raised questions about procedures, training, and oversight. Was there a hidden risk? Should patrols be modified? No changes were mandated. The patrols continued. Other blimps flew the same routes. The war demanded it. But the mystery of L8 lingered, a ghost blimp, drifting home without the men who flew it. Decades later, researchers and enthusiasts revisited the case, searching for new evidence or overlooked details. None materialized. The facts remained unchanged. 2 men, 1 blimp, an oil slick, a return flight without passengers, an empty gondola. The sea had taken Cody and Adams, if indeed it was the sea, or the sky had, or something else entirely. The blimp could not say. It came home silent, carrying only questions. Story 12, Dieppe. A raid that raised questions it could not answer. Operation Jubilee, the raid on Dieppe, was intended as a combined arms test. Commandos, infantry, tanks, air support, and naval gunfire coordinated against a fortified French port held by German forces. The objectives included destroying port facilities, capturing prisoners and intelligence, testing invasion techniques, and demonstrating Allied capability. The force numbered over 6,000 troops, predominantly Canadian, supported by British commandos and a small American Ranger detachment. The raid was a disaster. Within hours, over 3,600 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Tanks intended to support the infantry were trapped on the shingle beach, unable to climb the seawall or penetrate German defenses. Landing craft burned, bodies floated in the surf. The Germans, forewarned or simply well-prepared, poured fire from clifftop positions, bunkers, and buildings overlooking the beaches. By mid-morning, the decision was made to withdraw. Survivors scrambled back to landing craft under heavy fire. Many did not make it. The evacuation was chaotic, costly, and incomplete. When the last boats pulled away, the beach was littered with wreckage and the dead. The raid lasted less than 10 hours. Its failure was total, and in its aftermath, questions emerged that historians have debated ever since. Why was Dieppe chosen as a target? The port was heavily defended. German forces had months to fortify the cliffs and beaches. Intelligence reports indicated strong garrison presence. Aerial reconnaissance showed obstacles, gun positions, and overlapping fields of fire. Yet the raid proceeded. Planners argued that testing invasion techniques required a realistic target, a defended port, not an isolated stretch of beach. Dieppe offered the infrastructure and scale needed to evaluate tactics, equipment, and coordination under fire. The assumption was that speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower could overcome fixed defenses. That assumption proved catastrophic. The element of surprise was compromised before the first wave landed. A German coastal convoy encountered part of the raiding force at sea hours before hour. A brief naval engagement alerted German coastal defenses. By the time the main landings began, defenders were on alert. Machine guns were manned, artillery was ranged. The Canadians came ashore into a prepared killing zone. The beach itself was a trap. Dieppe's shingle loose, round stones immobilized tanks. The Churchill tanks rolled off landing craft, advanced a few yards, and sank into the shifting stones or became high-centered on seawalls. Unable to maneuver, they became stationary targets. German anti-tank guns and artillery methodically destroyed them. Infantry, pinned on the beach without armor support, faced enfilading fire from cliffs and buildings. Smoke laid to obscure movement was blown away by wind. Mortar and artillery shells walked across the beach, shredding formation. Casualties mounted within minutes. The flanking attacks, intended to suppress German positions on the heights, failed to achieve their objectives. Commandos achieved limited success on the extreme flanks, destroying coastal batteries, but the main assaults on the cliffs directly overlooking the beaches were repulsed. Without suppression, German gunners had unobstructed views of the beaches and killing zones. Air support, though numerically superior, could not effectively engage targets in the town without risking friendly fire. The close proximity of Allied troops to German positions limited what bombers and fighters could strike. The Luftwaffe contested the air battle, resulting in heavy dogfights overhead, but little impact on the ground battle. Naval gunfire support was inadequate. Destroyers offshore provided what fire they could, but the range, the need to avoid hitting friendly forces, and the limited time before withdrawal reduced their effectiveness. The raid's plan had assumed speed would minimize the need for sustained bombardment. The plan was wrong. The withdrawal, ordered around 11 in the morning, was nearly as costly as the landing. Troops had to fight their way back across exposed beach to landing craft. Many craft were destroyed or damaged offshore. Overcrowding, confusion, and continued fire killed men even as they attempted to escape. Some units were left behind, unable to reach evacuation points, and surrendered. When the final counts came in, the numbers were devastating. Of the approximately 6,086 men who landed or were involved in the operation, 3,367 Canadians were killed, wounded, or captured. British commandos and other units suffered additional casualties. The Luftwaffe and Royal Air Force fought a massive air battle, with heavy losses on both sides. Dozens of landing craft and naval vessels were sunk or damaged. What had the raid achieved? Tactically, almost nothing. No facilities were permanently destroyed. No significant intelligence was captured. The port remained functional. The Germans held the ground. The only tangible result was casualties. Strategically, planners later claimed the raid provided lessons learned that informed the eventual D-Day landings in 1944. Dieppe supposedly taught the Allies that frontal assaults on fortified ports were suicidal, that specialized armor was needed for beach obstacles, that overwhelming fire support and air superiority were prerequisites, and that intelligence and planning had to be exhaustive. These lessons were real, but they came at a price measured in thousands of lives. And the question remains, were they lessons that could only be learned through catastrophic failure? Critics argued that many of Dieppe's failures were foreseeable. Intelligence was available. Planners knew the beaches were difficult. The risks of insufficient fire support, inadequate surprise, and strong defenses were documented. Yet the raid proceeded. Why? Political and strategic pressures played roles. The Soviet Union demanded a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. The British and Canadians wanted to demonstrate offensive capability. The Americans, newly in the war, were eager for action. Dieppe was, in part, a political gesture, a visible operation to show that the Allies could strike occupied Europe. But political objectives do not explain every decision. The plan itself had flaws identified during rehearsals and reviews. Senior commanders expressed reservations. Yet, the operation was approved and launched. Some historians suggest institutional momentum. Once planned, the raid became difficult to cancel without political embarrassment. Others point to overconfidence, a belief that Allied troops could overcome obstacles that, in hindsight, were insurmountable. The deeper mystery is whether the raid's planners genuinely believed it could succeed, or whether they accepted high casualties as the cost of gathering information. If the latter, the ethical implications are profound. Men sent into battle not to win but to test, to learn, to generate data for future operations. No smoking gun document confirms this. Planners' memoirs and after-action reports emphasize the intent to achieve objectives, not to sacrifice troops for lessons. But the gap between intent and outcome is so vast that doubt persists. Could experienced military officers truly have believed the plan would work? Or did they accept the risk, knowing failure was likely, because the strategic need for data outweighed the human cost? The soldiers who landed at Dieppe had no such doubts. They believed in the mission. They trained for it. They expected to fight, to win, to return. Instead, they were slaughtered on a beach that became synonymous with futility. Survivors carried the trauma for life. The memory of friends cut down in the surf, tanks burning, orders shouted over gunfire. The helplessness of being pinned under fire with nowhere to go. Veterans' accounts describe chaos, terror, and bewilderment. A plan that collapsed on contact with reality, leaving men to improvise survival in a killing zone. Families of the dead received telegrams. Thousands of Canadian families lost sons in a single day, in a single raid, on a beach most had never heard of. The grief was compounded by questions. Why Dieppe? Why so many losses? What was gained? Official explanations emphasized bravery, sacrifice, and lessons for future victory. But they did not fully answer why the raid happened the way it did, why warnings were ignored, why men were sent into conditions that made success nearly impossible. Dieppe became a scar on Allied military history, a raid that achieved little, cost much, and left a legacy of questions more enduring than its tactical outcomes. The beach, the cliffs, the shingle, all remained. The men did not, and the reasons why they died there, beyond the mechanics of bullets and shells, remain contested. The raid tested Allied capabilities. It found them wanting. The price of that knowledge was written in blood on French sand, and the mystery lies not in what happened, which is clear, but in why it was allowed to happen at all. Story 13. HMS Dasher, a carrier that exploded at anchor. HMS Dasher was an escort carrier, converted from a merchant hull, designed to provide air cover for convoys. At 492 feet long, she displaced about 8,000 tons and carried aircraft fighters and torpedo bombers on a small flight deck. Her crew numbered over 500. On March 27, 1943, she was steaming in the Firth of Clyde, off the west coast of Scotland, having just completed training exercises. At approximately 4:40 in the afternoon, witnesses ashore and on nearby vessels saw a massive explosion tear through the carrier. Flames erupted from the hangar deck. The blast was so violent that parts of the ship were thrown into the air. Within minutes, Dasher was listing heavily. Within 8 minutes, she had capsized and sunk. Of the approximately 528 men aboard, only 149 survived. 379 died, killed by the explosion, trapped below decks, drowned in the cold water, or burned in the fires. The disaster happened so quickly that rescue efforts could save only those already in the water or blown clear. Ships nearby rushed to pick up survivors, but the majority of the crew went down with the carrier or died in the minutes after the explosion. The cause was never definitively established. The official investigation concluded that the explosion likely originated in the aviation fuel system. Escort carriers, converted from merchant hulls, had inherent vulnerabilities, poor ventilation in fuel spaces, inadequate fire suppression, and volatile aviation gasoline stored in confined areas. A fuel vapor leak, ignited by a spark from machinery, welding, or an electrical short, could trigger a catastrophic explosion. This explanation fit the facts: the location of the blast, the speed of the fire, the total destruction of the ship. But it did not fully satisfy, because critical evidence sank with the wreck. Alternative theories emerged. Some survivors and investigators suggested poor design and construction. Dasher was a hastily converted vessel, built quickly under wartime pressure. Safety features standard on purpose-built carriers were absent or inadequate. Fuel tanks were poorly isolated. Ventilation was insufficient. Watertight integrity was compromised by conversion work. Others pointed to specific negligence: smoking near fuel areas, improper handling of volatile materials, failure to follow safety protocols. Wartime crews, often newly trained, sometimes cut corners. A single match in the wrong place, a valve left open, a leak undetected, any of these could ignite disaster. Sabotage was considered but not supported by evidence. No credible suspects, no motive, no indication of tampering. The explosion was more consistent with accident than deliberate act. What made the loss particularly painful was the nature of escort carriers. These vessels were vital to the Battle of the Atlantic, providing air cover that closed the Atlantic gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach. Losing one to accident, not enemy action, felt wasteful. The speed of the sinking compounded the tragedy. 8 minutes from explosion to sinking left almost no time for organized evacuation. Watertight doors were blown open or jammed. Compartments flooded instantly. Men below decks had no chance. Those on the flight deck or upper levels had seconds to jump or were thrown into the water by the blast. The survivors' accounts described chaos. The explosion, sudden, deafening, disorienting. Fire spreading faster than men could run. The deck tilting. The order to abandon ship, shouted over the roar of flames. The plunge into freezing water. The screams. The silence as the carrier went under. Rescue ships pulled men from the water, many injured, burned, or in shock. Hypothermia claimed some even after rescue. The Firth of Clyde, though sheltered, was cold enough to kill in minutes. Survival depended on reaching a lifeboat or being picked up quickly. The Admiralty classified details of the disaster under wartime secrecy regulations. Families were notified of deaths, but given minimal information. The public learned only that a carrier had been lost in an accident. Full details remained restricted for decades. This secrecy fueled suspicion. Why hide the truth if it was simply an accident? Was there something embarrassing, something that reflected poorly on the Navy, that required concealment? The more prosaic answer was that all warship losses were treated as sensitive during the war. Revealing details about ship vulnerabilities, crew casualties, or operational failures could provide intelligence to the enemy and harm morale at home. Secrecy was standard, not evidence of a cover-up. But for families, the secrecy was agonizing. Fathers, sons, husbands, lost in an explosion that the government would not fully explain. Letters asking for details were met with form responses. The full story was withheld, ostensibly for security, but the effect was to deny closure. When records were eventually declassified, they confirmed what survivors had said: a fuel explosion, rapid sinking, heavy casualties. But they did not provide the precision families wanted. Exactly where did their loved one die? In the explosion? In the fire? Trapped below? Drowned? The wreck of HMS Dasher remains on the floor of the Firth of Clyde, a war grave protected by law. Diving and salvage are prohibited. The ship is a tomb for 379 men, and it will stay that way. The disaster had consequences beyond the immediate loss. The Royal Navy reviewed safety procedures on escort carriers. Fuel handling protocols were tightened. Ventilation systems were improved. Fire suppression equipment was upgraded. The lessons brought with Dasher's crew were applied to other vessels. But the changes could not bring back the dead. The explosion had been too fast, too complete. There was no second chance. The loss also highlighted the risks of wartime construction shortcuts, building ships quickly, converting civilian hulls, prioritizing quantity over refinement, all introduced risks. Dasher was one example. Other escort carriers suffered fires and explosions, though few were as catastrophic. The trade-off between speed and safety was real, and men paid the price. For the town of Ardrossen, near where Dasher sank, the disaster was local. Wreckage washed ashore. Bodies were recovered on beaches. The community buried sailors far from home. Memorials were erected, and for decades, the secrecy surrounding the loss made the tragedy feel incomplete. HMS Dasher's explosion remains a case study in how quickly warships can be lost to internal failures. Enemy action is expected, prepared for, understood. Accidental catastrophe is harder to accept. The ship should have been safe. The crew should have had time. But fire and physics do not wait for preparedness. The mystery, if it remains one, is in the margins, the exact ignition point, the precise sequence of failures, the specific choices that led to fuel vapor in a confined space meeting a spark. The investigation concluded, probable cause but not certainty, and without the wreck accessible, without survivors who witnessed the ignition, the final moment of causation stays inferential. What is certain? 379 men died when their ship exploded beneath them. They were training for war, not fighting it. They expected to go home. Instead, they went down with a carrier that burned and sank in minutes, leaving questions that outlasted the war and grief that never fully subsided. Story 14, Lady Be Good, a bomber swallowed by the desert. On the night of April 4th, 1943, a B-24 Liberator named Lady Be Good took off from Soluch airfield in Libya on its first combat mission. The target was the harbor at Naples, Italy, over 700 miles across the Mediterranean. The crew consisted of 9 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and 3 gunners. They were young, newly arrived in theater, eager and nervous. The raid itself was troubled from the start. A massive sandstorm delayed takeoff. By the time the bombers lifted off, timing was disrupted. Navigation over the Mediterranean at night, without modern aids, required precision, cloud cover, obscured landmarks. Radio beacons were unreliable, the formation scattered. Lady Be Good reached the target area but, unable to locate the primary objective through clouds, turned back without dropping bombs. The return flight, over open water in darkness, demanded exact navigation. The crew had to estimate wind drift, calculate fuel consumption, and identify the African coast in time to find their airfield. They never found it. Lady Be Good flew over the coast, over the airfield, and kept flying south into the Libyan desert. The crew, apparently believing they were still over the Mediterranean, continued on course, expecting to sight land. They did not realize they had already crossed it. At some point, fuel ran low. The pilot ordered bailout. All 9 men parachuted into the desert night. The bomber, now pilotless, flew on until fuel was exhausted and crashed in the sand. The crew, scattered across miles of desert, regrouped at dawn and began walking north, toward where they believed rescue would come. It never came. The crew of Lady Be Good walked for days. They had limited water canteen rations from their bailout survival kits. They had no map showing their position. They had no radio contact. They had only the certainty that civilization lay north and the hope that they could reach it. One by one, they died. Dehydration, heat, exhaustion. Their bodies, mummified by the desert's dryness, were found years later along a trail leading north, some together, some alone, each marking the point where strength failed. For 15 years, no one knew what had happened to Lady Be Good. The bomber was listed as missing, presumed lost over the Mediterranean. The crew was declared dead. Families mourned without graves, without certainty, without answers. Then, in November 1958, a British oil exploration team flying over the Libyan desert spotted wreckage. A survey revealed a mostly intact bomber sitting in the sand, 400 miles south of the coast, in one of the most remote and desolate regions of the Sahara. It was Lady Be Good. The discovery stunned investigators. The aircraft was almost perfectly preserved. The dry desert air had prevented corrosion. Paint was intact. Equipment was functional. The radio still worked when powered. Inside, coffee in canteens was still drinkable. Guns were operable. The bomber looked as if it had been parked, not crashed. But the crew was missing. Search parties, using the aircraft as a starting point, began combing the desert. They found flight gear, parachutes, and eventually the remains of 8 of the 9 crewmen scattered across miles of sand along a northward track. The story emerged from evidence left behind. The crew had bailed out successfully. They had survived the night. At dawn, seeing empty desert in all directions, they chose to walk north. They traveled together initially, then split as individuals faltered. They left markers, bits of parachute, equipment, messages scratched in the sand. One crew member's diary, recovered with his remains, documented the final days. Entries were brief, matter-of-fact, and devastating. Walked all day, no water. Still walking, very weak. No help. The last entry was a few scrawled words, then silence. The 9th crew member's remains were never found. He walked farther than the others, or in a different direction, and the desert claimed him completely. The mystery of Lady Be Good is not how the crew died. Dehydration and exposure in the desert are well understood. The mystery is why the bomber flew so far south in the first place. Navigation error is the clear answer, but the specifics matter. The crew believed they were over water when they were over land. They believed they were approaching the coast when they had already crossed it. Why? One explanation involves a tailwind. Strong winds from the north, unaccounted for in navigation calculations, could have pushed the bomber southward faster than expected. The crew, calculating based on airspeed and expected wind, would have estimated their position as still over the Mediterranean when they had already crossed the coast and flown deep into the desert. Cloud cover compounded the error. If the crew could not see the ground, they had no visual confirmation of landfall. At night, without lights below, the desert and the sea looked identical, dark, featureless expanses. Radio navigation aids were limited. Beacons could guide aircraft to the general area, but precise positioning required skill and clear signals. Interference, equipment malfunction, or operator error could leave a crew flying blind. The bomber's fuel consumption was a known quantity. When fuel gauges showed reserves running low, the pilot assumed they were still over water and ordered bailout to avoid ditching at sea, which was often fatal. The irony that they were over land and could have attempted a landing was cruel. The crew's decision to walk north was rational given what they believed. They had bailed out over the Mediterranean, or so they thought, and parachuted onto land. Therefore, land must be nearby. Walking north would reach the coast and their base. But they had not bailed out near the coast. They had bailed out hundreds of miles inland. Walking north led them deeper into the desert, not toward rescue. The desert is vast, empty, and lethal. Temperatures in April can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in daylight. Water sources do not exist. Vegetation is sparse. The sand stretches horizon to horizon without landmark or shade. The crew walked through a landscape that offered nothing, no water, no shelter, no hope. Their survival time was limited by the water they carried. Desert survival estimates suggest a person in such conditions, walking during the day, can survive perhaps 2 to 3 days without water. The crew exceeded that testimony to endurance and willpower, but biology has limits. The preservation of the bomber allowed detailed investigation. Fuel tanks were empty, confirming the crew had flown until exhaustion. Controls were in positions consistent with straight and level flight until fuel starvation. The autopilot had been engaged, suggesting the pilot set the aircraft on course before ordering bailout. The plane flew on after the crew jumped, eventually descending when engines quit and crashing in a relatively controlled glide into soft sand, which minimized damage. The recovery of remains and personal effects allowed identification. Families, 15 years after loss, finally received confirmation. Bodies were repatriated and buried. The crew of Lady Be Good, missing for over a decade, came home. The bomber itself was partially salvaged. Parts were removed for analysis and museum display. The fuselage, too large and remote to move, was left in the desert, where it gradually deteriorated under wind and sun. By the 1990s, little remained. The story of Lady Be Good became legendary, a ghost bomber found intact in the desert, a crew that walked to their deaths, believing rescue was just over the horizon. It captured the imagination because it was both tragic and eerily preserved, a moment frozen in time until rediscovery. For historians and aviation analysts, it serves as a case study in navigation error, the limits of technology, and the unforgiving nature of desert survival. For families, it brought closure, painful but real. The crew of Lady Be Good did not die in combat. They died lost, walking through empty sand, believing help was near. The desert kept their secret for 15 years, then gave it back not all at once, but piece by piece, mile by mile, a trail of bones leading north toward a hope that was never there. Story 15: Mutsu, the explosion in Hiroshima Bay. Mutsu was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful warships, a Nagato-class battleship, 708 feet long, displacing over 39,000 tons. Armed with 8 16-inch guns, she had served since 1921, a symbol of Japanese naval strength. On June 8, 1943, she was moored in Hiroshima Bay, south of the main naval base at Kure, participating in training exercises with a crew of about 1,474 men. At approximately 12:13 in the afternoon, without warning, a massive explosion tore through the ship's forward section. The blast was catastrophic, magazines detonating, armor plates blown apart, flames erupting hundreds of feet into the air. The forward part of the ship disintegrated. Within minutes, Mutsu capsized and sank. Approximately 1,121 men died. Only 353 survived, mostly those stationed aft or on deck who were blown clear or able to jump before the ship went under. The explosion shocked Japan, a capital ship in a protected anchorage, destroyed without enemy action. The loss was militarily significant. Battleships were precious assets, but the circumstances were deeply troubling. How does a battleship explode at anchor? The Imperial Japanese Navy launched an immediate investigation. Survivors were interrogated. Wreckage was salvaged. Technical experts examined the remains. But the investigation faced a fundamental problem. The section of the ship where the explosion originated, the forward magazines, was obliterated. Physical evidence was fragmentary at best. The official conclusion, released after months of inquiry, attributed the explosion to accidental detonation of ammunition in a magazine. The exact cause of ignition was listed as unknown, though possibilities included spontaneous combustion of unstable propellant, electrical malfunction, or human error. But alternative explanations persisted, fueled by the incompleteness of the investigation and the wartime atmosphere of suspicion. Sabotage was the most persistent theory. Japan in 1943 was fighting a global war. Saboteurs, whether enemy agents, disgruntled crew, or resistance sympathizers, could theoretically have placed an explosive device or tampered with ammunition. The destruction of a major warship would be a significant blow. Evidence for sabotage was circumstantial at best. No device was found, no confession was obtained, no witness reported seeing anything suspicious prior to the blast. Security aboard capital ships was tight. Access to magazines was restricted. The likelihood of an outsider placing a bomb or a crew member committing sabotage without detection seemed low. But the theory endured because the alternative, pure accident, was almost as hard to accept. Ammunition magazines on battleships were designed with multiple safety features. Propellant was stored in controlled conditions. Handling procedures were strict. For a magazine to detonate spontaneously required a chain of failures. Unstable ammunition was one plausible trigger. Propellant charges, especially older stocks or those stored in suboptimal conditions, could degrade over time. Chemical breakdown could make them sensitive to shock, temperature, or friction. A single charge igniting could trigger sympathetic detonation of nearby charges, escalating to full magazine explosion. Japan's wartime logistics, strained by years of conflict, might have led to use of degraded or improperly stored munitions. Quality control, under pressure to supply the fleet, could have lapsed. Mutsu might have been carrying ammunition that was, unknowingly, unstable. Electrical malfunction was another possibility. Battleship magazines contained electrical systems for lighting, ventilation, and ammunition hoists. A short circuit, generating heat or sparks near propellant, could ignite it. Wartime maintenance, often rushed or incomplete, might have left faulty wiring undetected. Human error, a dropped shell, improper handling, unauthorized smoking was considered but deemed unlikely. Magazine crews were trained, disciplined, and aware of the lethal consequences of mistakes. The investigation found no evidence of procedural violations. What complicated the inquiry was the political dimension. Admitting sabotage would imply security failures and internal enemies embarrassing and demoralizing. Admitting poor ammunition quality or maintenance lapses would reflect badly on supply and engineering commands. Declaring the cause unknown would invite speculation. The pressure to provide a definitive explanation, one that did not undermine confidence or morale, was immense. The final report balanced these pressures. It acknowledged accident as most likely, listed possible technical causes, but stopped short of definitive conclusions. The ambiguity allowed different audiences to draw different conclusions. Internationally, the loss of Mutsu was noted by Allied intelligence as a reduction in Japanese naval strength. The cause was less important than the result, one fewer battleship to contest the Pacific. Domestically, the disaster was a blow to morale, particularly among Navy families. Over 1,000 men dead in an instant, not from enemy action but from something that happened aboard their own ship. The lack of a clear enemy to blame made the grief harder to process. The salvage operation recovered part of the wreck. The aft section, less damaged, was raised and examined. The forward section, destroyed in the blast, remained on the seabed. Salvaged components were analyzed for clues. Some showed evidence consistent with explosion, torn metal, blast patterns, but nothing that pointed to a single, incontrovertible cause. Survivors' testimony varied. Some remembered a flash, others heard a sound first. A few reported feeling the deck heave before the explosion. The accounts, while consistent in describing catastrophic destruction, did not converge on a specific trigger. The mystery of Mutsu's explosion is less about what happened, a magazine detonated, and more about why. The physical mechanism is understood, the specific cause is not. In the decades after the war, researchers revisited the case. Japanese naval historians examined declassified records. Technical experts modeled explosion scenarios. New theories were proposed. None achieved consensus. The sabotage theory, while dramatic, lacks supporting evidence. The accident theory, while plausible, cannot be proven without physical evidence that no longer exists. And so the loss of Mutsu remains unresolved, a battleship that exploded for reasons documented as unknown, a tragedy that claimed over 1,000 lives and left a gap in the historical record. For the families of the dead, the ambiguity was a wound that did not heal. Fathers and sons lost in an explosion that the Navy could not fully explain. Was it accident? Was it sabotage? Was it negligence? The absence of answers compounded the absence of the men. Memorials were erected, names were inscribed, the dead were honored, but the questions remained, embedded in the official reports that said probable and possible and unknown. Mutsu's wreck lies in Hiroshima Bay, a war grave protected from disturbance. The ship that once symbolized strength rests as a reminder of fragility, how quickly steel and fire can erase lives, and how some moments of destruction leave mysteries that even exhaustive investigation cannot close. Story 16, Sikorski at Gibraltar. General Władysław Sikorski was the leader of the Polish government in exile, based in London, and commander-in-chief of Polish forces fighting alongside the Allies. On July 4, 1943, he was returning from an inspection tour of Polish forces in the Middle East. His aircraft, a Liberator bomber configured for VIP transport, took off from Gibraltar just after 11 o'clock at night, bound for Britain. 16 seconds after takeoff, the Liberator crashed into the sea just offshore. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft broke apart on contact with the water. Of the 16 people aboard, only the pilot survived. Sikorski, his daughter, and all other passengers and crew were killed. The loss of Sikorski was a political earthquake. He was the unifying figure of the Polish resistance and exile movement, the leader recognized by the Allies, and a symbol of Poland's continued fight against Nazi occupation. His death raised immediate questions, and within hours, speculation about sabotage began. The official investigation, conducted by the Royal Air Force, concluded that the crash was caused by jamming of the aircraft's elevator controls shortly after takeoff. The exact mechanism of the jamming was not determined, but the report suggested mechanical failure or obstruction of the control system. The finding was accident, not sabotage. But doubt persisted. The timing was suspicious. Sikorski's death came at a moment of intense political tension between the Polish government in exile and the Soviet Union. Relations had deteriorated over the Katyn massacre, the mass execution of Polish officers by Soviet forces in 1940, a crime the Soviets denied and blamed on Germany. Sikorski had pushed for an international investigation, infuriating Moscow. His death removed a vocal critic of Soviet conduct and a leader capable of rallying Western support for Poland's independence. Who benefited from Sikorski's death? The Soviets had clear motive. Removing Sikorski weakened the Polish exile government and reduced pressure on Moscow over Katyn. Soviet intelligence services were capable of sabotage operations, and Gibraltar, though British territory, had porous security, Spanish workers, neutral ship traffic, and the possibility of infiltration. But evidence of Soviet involvement was absent. No device was found, no saboteur was identified, no intercepted communications pointed to Soviet action. The investigation, while thorough, focused on mechanical failure and human factors, not sabotage, because no physical evidence supported it. The Germans also had motive. Sikorski was a leader of enemy forces. His death might demoralize the Poles and disrupt Allied cooperation. German intelligence operated in Spain, adjacent to Gibraltar. But again, no evidence linked German agents to the crash. Internal Polish factions were another theory. Sikorski had political rivals within the exile movement. Some disagreed with his policies toward the Soviets or his leadership style. Could dissidents within Polish ranks have arranged his death? The theory rested on speculation, not facts, and investigators found no credible suspects or plots. Accident remained the most evidence-supported explanation. The Liberator had undergone maintenance before the flight. Control systems on aircraft are complex and vulnerable to malfunction. A control cable could jam, a pulley could seize, a foreign object could obstruct movement. The aircraft was carrying a heavy load. Takeoff from Gibraltar's short runway over water at night demanded precise control. A sudden jam in the elevator, the control surface governing pitch, could render the aircraft uncontrollable within seconds of liftoff. The pilot's survival was both fortunate and problematic. He was the sole witness to the final moments. His testimony described a loss of control shortly after takeoff. The aircraft pitched down despite his efforts to pull up. He reported fighting the controls, feeling resistance, and then impact. He was thrown clear or exited the wreckage and was rescued from the water. His account supported mechanical failure, but some questioned whether he was entirely truthful or whether he might have been complicit, either through negligence or intent. The investigation cleared him of wrongdoing, finding no evidence of pilot error or sabotage, but conspiracy theories persisted. The wreckage was not extensively salvaged. Parts were recovered, enough to examine control systems, but the deep water and wartime priorities limited forensic analysis. The elevator mechanism, the key component that might have shown jamming, was not definitively examined. Without it, the investigation relied on deduction and pilot testimony. The political aftermath of Sikorski's death was immediate. The Polish government in exile appointed a successor, but no one commanded Sikorski's stature. The unity he maintained among factions fractured. Relations with the Soviets worsened. At the Tehran Conference, later in 1943, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill discussed Poland's future, and the Polish exile government found itself sidelined. Had Sikorski lived, could he have altered Poland's post-war fate? Possibly not. Stalin's determination to dominate Eastern Europe was already clear. But his death removed a voice that might have influenced negotiations, rallied Western support, or shaped how Poland's tragedy was understood. For the Polish people, especially those in exile and those fighting in Allied armies, Sikorski's death was devastating. He was a symbol of hope, a leader who promised eventual liberation. Losing him in an accident felt cruelly random. Losing him to potential sabotage felt like another betrayal in a war already full of them. Conspiracy theories around the crash were fueled by the era's mistrust and the lack of complete transparency. Wartime investigations, conducted under secrecy and time pressure, often left gaps. Documents were classified, witnesses were unavailable or unreliable, and political sensitivities shaped what could be publicly stated. In the decades after the war, researchers revisited the Sikorski crash. Files were declassified, witnesses were interviewed anew, technical experts examined the evidence, conclusions remained divided. Some historians accepted the accident, pointing to the mechanical evidence and absence of sabotage proof. Others saw too many unanswered questions. Why was control jamming not definitively demonstrated? Why were security lapses at Gibraltar not more thoroughly investigated? Why did the Soviets and Germans, both with motive, face so little scrutiny? The truth, if fully knowable, likely rests in a combination of factors that no longer exist to examine: a piece of wreckage on the seabed, a cable inside a control system, a conversation never recorded. What remains is a leader dead in a crash, an investigation that concluded accident, and a political context that makes sabotage plausible even without proof. Sikorski is buried in Poland, his remains repatriated after the war. Memorials honor him, historians debate him, and the question of his death, accident, or assassination remains one of the Second World War's enduring political mysteries. The aircraft took off into darkness, climbed briefly, and fell. 16 people entered the water, 1 survived. And with the 15 who died, including Sikorski, went certainty about why the plane crashed and whether the war's hidden hand had pushed it down. Story 17. The crossword that touched D-Day. In May 1944, as planning for the Allied invasion of Europe reached its final and most sensitive phase, a London newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, published a crossword puzzle that quietly alarmed British intelligence. Several of the puzzle's solutions matched highly classified invasion code words: Utah, Omaha, Overlord, Neptune, and Mulberry. These were not common words. They were operational code words, known only to planners and kept under the strictest secrecy. Their appearance in a public puzzle seemed impossible to dismiss as coincidence. MI5 interrogated the crossword compiler, Leonard Daw, a schoolteacher with no known connections to military intelligence or espionage. Daw insisted the words were random choices, selected for their letter patterns and puzzle compatibility. He had no knowledge of invasion plans. He was not a spy. The investigation found no evidence of deliberate leakage. Daw's background was clean. His explanations were consistent. The puzzle's publication schedule predated the code word's final assignment by weeks, making intentional inclusion logistically implausible. The conclusion: extraordinary coincidence. Decades later, a former student of Daw's suggested that soldiers training near the school had used the code words in casual conversation, overheard by students who then fed them to Daw as potential crossword entries, unaware of their significance. This theory, plausible but unverified, offers a middle ground between pure chance and espionage. What made the incident enduring was not its resolution accident, not conspiracy, but its proximity to catastrophe. Had the code words genuinely leaked, had German intelligence noticed and connected the dots, the invasion's secrecy might have been compromised. The margin between security and disaster was a newspaper puzzle. The crossword became a footnote, a near miss in the vast machinery of D-Day secrecy. The invasion succeeded. The code words remained secure, and the mystery dissolved into coincidence, strange, unnerving, but ultimately harmless. Story 18. Saint-Exupery, a writer lost over water. Antoine de Saint-Exupery, author of The Little Prince and celebrated aviator, was 54 years old when he disappeared. By 1944, he was officially too old for combat flying, his health compromised by previous crashes. But he had connections, determination, and a conviction that writing about the war required witnessing it from the cockpit. He rejoined reconnaissance units, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Corsica, photographing German positions in southern France ahead of the Allied invasion. The missions were dangerous, unarmed photo runs over defended territory, relying on speed and altitude for survival. On July 31, 1944, Saint-Exupery took off from Borgo Airfield on a reconnaissance mission over the French Riviera. His route would take him over Grenoble, Annecy, and back. Weather was clear. He carried camera equipment, oxygen, and fuel for 5 hours of flight. He never returned. The disappearance triggered searches. Aircraft and boats scanned the Mediterranean. No wreckage was found. No distress signal had been sent. Saint-Exupery simply vanished. Theories emerged immediately. He could have been shot down by German fighters or anti-aircraft fire. The route passed over occupied France, and Luftwaffe fighters patrolled the area. A P-38, while fast, was vulnerable to surprise attack, especially if the pilot was focused on photography rather than combat maneuvering. Mechanical failure was possible. P-38s, though reliable, operated at high altitude where oxygen systems, superchargers, and engines face stress. A malfunction, engine failure, oxygen deprivation, cockpit fire could incapacitate the pilot or cripple the aircraft. Ditching at sea or crashing into the mountains could explain the absence of wreckage. Suicide was whispered but rarely stated publicly. Saint-Exupery had expressed melancholy in letters and conversations. He was estranged from his wife, grieving for France's suffering, exhausted by war. Some who knew him wondered whether he chose not to return, but no evidence supported this beyond speculation. Decades passed. The mystery remained. Then, in 1998, a fisherman off Marseille recovered a silver identity bracelet engraved with Saint-Exupery's name and his publisher's address. The discovery confirmed the general location, but not the cause. In 2000, wreckage was located on the seabed near Marseille. Fragments of a P-38, later identified through serial numbers as Saint-Exupery's aircraft. The wreck was scattered, broken, partially buried in sediment. The discovery answered where, but not why. Examination of the wreckage showed impact damage consistent with hitting the water at high speed. No bullet holes were definitively identified, though corrosion made analysis difficult. The scatter pattern suggested the aircraft broke apart on impact or shortly before, possibly from structural failure at altitude. In 2008, a former Luftwaffe pilot, Horst Rippert, claimed he had shot down a P-38 on July 31, 1944, in the area where Saint-Exupery disappeared. Rippert, who had known and admired Saint-Exupery's writing, expressed regret but insisted he had only seen an enemy aircraft and engaged it according to his duty. He claimed no certainty it was Saint-Exupery, only that the time and place matched. Rippert's account was met with skepticism. No German records corroborated the claim. Rippert's memory, recounted over 60 years later, could not be verified. And the wreckage, while damaged, did not definitively show combat hits. The most likely scenario, based on available evidence, is that Saint-Exupery suffered mechanical failure or medical emergency, hypoxia, heart attack, while over the Mediterranean, leading to a crash. The P-38 hit the water, broke apart, and sank. The pilot, unable to escape or already incapacitated, went down with it. But certainty eludes. The wreck is fragmentary. The pilot's body was never recovered. And the final moments, whether he fought to control a failing aircraft, whether he was conscious, whether he saw the water coming, are unknown. Saint-Exupery's loss was felt beyond aviation. He was a voice of humanism, a writer who believed in the nobility of flight and the fragility of human connection. His disappearance felt symbolic, a poet swallowed by the war he chronicled, a man who loved the sky claimed by it. His works endured. The Little Prince became one of the most translated books in history. His memoirs of early aviation, night flight, wind, sand and stars captured the romance and terror of flight. His disappearance added a tragic coda. The writer, who celebrated life in the air, lost to it. For France, Saint-Exupery became a figure of memory and mystery. He was honored, commemorated, mourned. But the absence of his body, the uncertainty of his final flight, left his story incomplete. He was gone, but not entirely found, present in literature, absent in the flesh. The Mediterranean holds many wrecks, many missing pilots. Saint-Exupery is one among thousands, but his fame, his words, and the unanswered questions of his death keep his story alive. He flew into the bright afternoon and did not come back. The sea took him and gave back only fragments. 19. Glenn Miller. Music into fog. Glenn Miller, one of America's most famous musicians, had joined the war effort not as a soldier, but as an entertainer. His Army Air Forces band performed for troops across Europe, bringing music and morale to men far from home. By December 1944, Miller was preparing for performances in newly liberated Paris. On December 15, he boarded a small, single-engine UC-64 Norseman aircraft at an airfield in England. To Paris was routine. Hundreds of similar trips were flown daily. Weather was poor, fog, low clouds, but not prohibitive. The pilot, Officer John Morgan, was experienced. They took off in the early afternoon. The aircraft never arrived. No distress call. No wreckage found. When Mueller failed to appear in Paris, inquiries began. The flight was not officially logged. Morgan had arranged it informally as a favor, outside normal channels. This administrative gap delayed the search and compounded the mystery. Theories about Mueller's disappearance have proliferated for 80 years. The most straightforward explanation is weather. The Norseman, small utility aircraft, was vulnerable to icing, fog, and poor visibility. If ice accumulated on wings or the engine failed in cold conditions, pilot might have lost control and crashed into the channel. The impact would sink the plane quickly, leaving no debris visible from the air. Navigation error is another possibility. In fog, without modern instruments, pilots relied on compass, landmarks, and skill. A wrong heading could take the Norseman off course into bad weather or over empty ocean where fuel would exhaust. Ditching in the channel was often fatal. The cold water, the impact, the distance from rescue. Friendly fire has been proposed. On December 15, RAF bombers returning from Germany jettisoned unused bombs over the channel to lighten their load before landing. A formation of Lancasters dumped ordnance in the same general area and timeframe Mueller's flight crossed. Could the Norseman have been struck by falling bombs? The theory is plausible but unproven. The bomber crews did not report hitting an aircraft, and the vastness of the channel makes coincidental impact unlikely. Mechanical failure fits the known vulnerabilities of the Norseman. Engine trouble, carburetor icing, or control malfunction could down the aircraft. Without a distress call, the failure would have been sudden, no time to radio. German action, interception by a fighter or anti-aircraft fire, is less likely. The Norseman was unarmed and flew over Allied, controlled waters. No German claims matched the incident. Luftwaffe activity over the channel in December 1944 was minimal. Conspiracy theories suggest Mueller's death was staged on a secret mission, or that he died of other causes and the flight story was cover. These theories lack evidence and rest on speculation. Mueller's role was entertainment, not espionage. His value to morale made his death a loss, not an asset to conceal. Absence of wreckage is frustrating but not unusual. The channel is deep, currents strong. Small aircraft, hitting water at speed, apart and sink. Searches in 1944 covered thousands of square miles but relied on visual sighting. A wreck on the Seeb water could easily remain undiscovered. Decades later, hunters and researchers have searched for the Norseman using sonar and archival research. No confirmed wreck has been found. Channel holds many missing aircraft, and identifying any specific one is difficult without clear markers. Disappearance resonated because he was a public figure. His music was soundtrack to the war years. In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade, Chattanooga Choo Choo. Millions knew his sound. His loss felt personal to a generation. For the army and the public, the mystery was painful. A man who had brought joy, who had volunteered his talent, was gone without explanation. Families of servicemen lost in anonymous circumstances saw their grief mirrored in Mueller's disappearance. A famous man vanished, as their unknown sons had. Memorials honored Mueller. His music played on, but the unanswered question, what happened over the channel, lingered. The flight into fog became metaphor, a life cut short, a story without ending, a final note that never resolved. The most likely truth is simple and tragic: bad weather, mechanical failure, navigational error led to a crash. The channel took the plane, the pilot, and the passenger. No conspiracy, no drama, the cold arithmetic of aviation risk and the ocean's refusal to give back what it claims. Music filled the war years, and then one day, the bandleader flew into grey skies and did not return. The silence where his music had been was the only answer. Story 20. Raoul Wallenberg. Then unseen, Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat stationed in Budapest during the final year of the war. In 1944, the Holocaust reached Hungary. Wallenberg issued protective Swedish passports and sheltered Jews in buildings designated as Swedish territory. Efforts are credited with saving tens of thousands of lives. When Soviet forces liberated Budapest in January 1945, Wallenberg was summoned to Soviet headquarters. He went willingly, expecting to discuss relief efforts and diplomatic matters. He was arrested. The reasons for his arrest remain debated. Soviet authorities may have suspected him of espionage. Western diplomats operating in occupied territory were often viewed with suspicion. Contacts with German and Hungarian officials necessary for his rescue work might have appeared as collaboration, or he may have simply been caught in Stalin's paranoid security apparatus, which detained thousands without clear rationale. Wallenberg disappeared into the Soviet prison system. Family and Swedish government inquiries were met with silence, then denials. For years, the Soviet government claimed no knowledge of Wallenberg. Later, they said he had died in Lubyanka prison in 1947 of a heart attack. The evidence was murky. The death certificate was produced decades after the alleged death. Witnesses, fellow prisoners, former guards, reported seeing Wallenberg alive in Soviet camps in the 1950s. Even the 1960s and 1970s, sightings were unverified but persistent. The Swedish government pressed for answers. Investigations were launched. Pressure was applied. The Soviets provided limited information, often contradictory. Files were said to be missing, were incomplete. The trail, such as it was, led into bureaucratic darkness. Why did the Soviets arrest and hold Wallenberg? The simplest explanation is that he was valuable, either as a potential intelligence source or as a bargaining chip. His prominence, Western connections, and his wartime activities made him interesting to Soviet intelligence. Alternatively, he may have been detained as a precaution, then forgotten. The Soviet system imprisoned millions. Individuals could vanish into the gulag, their files misfiled or lost, their existence erased from official memory. Wallenberg may have been one casualty of administrative indifference. Claim of death in 1947 is disputed. If true, it suggests he was interrogated, deemed useless or uncooperative, either executed or allowed to die of neglect. If false, it implies he survived longer, held in camps where witnesses later claimed to see him. Physical evidence. Body, grave definitive record, has ever been produced. The Soviet government, and later the Russian government, maintained that Wallenberg died in 1947 and that no further information exists. But declassified files, partial and redacted, add gaps and inconsistencies. For Wallenberg's family, the uncertainty was agony. He had been a hero, recognized even during the war for his courage. To lose him to Soviet detention, without trial, without confirmation of death, without a grave, cruelty compounded by bureaucracy. For Sweden, Wallenberg became a symbol of diplomatic failure. A citizen detained by an ally, government could not or would not secure his release. The case strained Swedish-Soviet relations for decades. For the Jewish community, Wallenberg's fate was a bitter irony. He had saved lives at enormous personal risk. His reward was disappearance, imprisonment, and likely death at the hands of the very forces that had ended the Holocaust. The mystery of Wallenberg is not what happened in the immediate sense. He was arrested, detained, and probably died in Soviet custody. Mystery is the why and the when. Why arrest a neutral diplomat engaged in humanitarian work? Why hold him for years? Why hide the truth? The answers likely lie in paranoia, bureaucracy, and the Soviet state's casual disregard for individual life. Wallenberg was expendable. Detention served some transient purpose, or no purpose at all. And when he ceased to be useful, he was discarded. The absence of a body, a confirmed death date, and a full accounting keeps the case open. Technically, Wallenberg could still be listed as missing, though all realistic assessments conclude he is long dead. His legacy outlived the mystery. Wallenberg is honored worldwide as a righteous among the nations, a hero who acted when others looked away. Streets, monuments, and institutions bear his name. His story is taught as an example of moral courage. But the final chapter, how he died, where he is buried, his last years were like, remains unwritten. The Soviet Union took him and never gave him back. Not even as remains, not even as truth. 21 Awa Maru relief ship torpedoed. Disputed Awa Maru was a Japanese passenger liner converted to transport relief supplies to Allied prisoners of war held by Japan. International Red Cross negotiated the arrangement. Japan would deliver food and medicine to POW camps. In exchange, the United States guaranteed safe passage. The ship was painted with large red crosses. Illuminated at night, routes communicated to Allied forces. On April 1, 1945, Awa Maru was steaming through the Taiwan Strait, turning to Japan from Southeast Asia, when she was spotted by the American submarine USS Queenfish. The submarine's captain, the ship to be a legitimate military target, ordered an attack. 4 torpedoes hit. Awa Maru sank in minutes. Approximately 2,004 people aboard, only 1 survived. A young steward who was pulled from the water by Queenfish after the sinking. When the submarine surfaced and realized the ship bore Red Cross markings, the crew understood the enormity of the mistake. The captain radioed headquarters. The incident was immediately recognized as a serious violation of the Safe Passage Agreement. The US convened a court-martial. The submarine commander was found guilty of negligence for failing to properly identify the target despite the safe passage notification. Relieved of command, but not otherwise severely punished, reflecting the fog of war context. Japan protested the sinking as a war crime. The United States acknowledged the error and offered compensation. But the controversy did not end with official statements. The mystery surrounding Awa Maru concerns what she was carrying. The official manifest listed Red Cross supplies, food, medicine for Palus and civilian internees. But persistent rumors suggested the ship also carried contraband, gold, platinum, industrial diamonds, art, and strategic materials being evacuated from Japanese-occupied territories as the war turned against Japan. Contraband is circumstantial. Japanese shipping in 1945 was desperate, fleets depleted, supply lines cut, desperation mounting. Using a protected relief ship to smuggle valuables would be logical, if illegal. Presence of high-ranking officials and military personnel among the passengers fueled suspicion that the voyage was more than humanitarian. Salvage expeditions attempted to explore the wreck in later decades. Devas reported finding scattered cargo, some consistent with relief supplies, ambiguous. Claims of treasure recovered were made, but rarely substantiated. The depth, the wreck's condition, legal disputes over ownership complicated efforts. The one survivor, the steward, provided limited information, described the sinking, the explosions, the screaming, the cold water, but knew little about cargo. He had been working below decks, not involved in loading or manifests. The central question remains, was Awa Maru purely a relief ship, smuggling valuables under the cover of Red Cross protection? If the latter, did US intelligence know and target her accordingly? Was the sinking truly an accident? A captain misidentifying a ship in fog and night conditions? No definitive answer has emerged. Japanese records, if they exist, were lost or remain classified. American records document the attack, but not detailed intelligence on Awa Maru's cargo. The wreck, buried in silt and disputed waters, yielded conclusive evidence. The tragedy's human dimension is undeniable. Over 2,000 people died, many of them civilians, including women and children. Whether they were traveling on a relief ship or a smuggling vessel, their deaths were casualties of war's late phase. The sinking also highlighted the erosion of wartime rules. Safe passage agreements depended on trust and verification. 5. Trust was gone. Submarines operated under orders to sink anything suspicious. Verification in darkness, from a periscope, imperfect. The result was catastrophe. For the families of those lost aboard Awa Maru, the mystery of the cargo mattered less than the loss itself. Loved ones were gone, drowned in the Taiwan Strait. Their bodies never recovered. Whether the ship carried gold or grain did not bring them back. The ship rests on the seabed, if any, sealed in corroded holds and scattered debris. The ocean keeps what it takes. Awa Maru is another name on the long list of vessels claimed by war, mystery, and the unforgiving sea. Story 22. Hinrich Mueller, Gestapo chief who disappeared. Hinrich Mueller was the chief of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, responsible for implementing terror, repression, and the machinery of the Holocaust. He was one of the most powerful and feared figures in the Third Reich. As Berlin fell to Soviet forces in May 1945, Mueller was last seen in the FIH bunker area. Then he disappeared. No confirmed death. No grave. No trial. No post-war sighting verified beyond doubt. Mueller simply ceased to exist in the historical record. Theories about his fate range from death in the ruins to escape and concealment. The simplest explanation: Mueller died in Berlin's final battle. Chaos, street fighting, artillery collapsing buildings. Thousands died unidentified. Mueller, wearing a uniform that made him a target, killed by Soviet troops, German deserters, or caught in bombardment. His body, if unmarked or disfigured, might have been buried in a mass grave or left unidentified. A grave in Berlin, marked with Mueller's name, was exhumed in 1963. The remains did not match his dental records. The grave was either mislabeled or Mueller was never in it. Escape is the alternative. Mueller had resources, contacts, and motivation to flee. If he reached Allied lines, he might have offered intelligence in exchange for protection. Western intelligence agencies recruited former Nazis when their knowledge was deemed useful. Mueller, with intimate knowledge of Soviet intelligence and Nazi security, would have been valuable. No credible evidence places Mueller in Western custody. Declassified files from the CIA and British intelligence mention him, but show no indication he was recruited or sheltered. Capture is another possibility. If Mueller was detained by Red Army forces, he might have been interrogated, used, and then executed or imprisoned anonymously. The Soviets took many high-ranking Nazis into custody. Some were tried, some vanished. Mueller could have been one of the latter. Sightings were reported over the years. In South America, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, none were verified. Photographs were compared, witnesses questioned, but no confirmation ever emerged. The most likely scenario: died in Berlin, his body unidentified or misidentified, lost in the mass casualties of the city's fall. Bureaucratic collapse meant records were incomplete. The chaos meant bodies went unprocessed. The man who had overseen meticulous documentation of millions became, in death, just another unmarked casualty. But the absence of proof allows doubt. The man who ran the apparatus of terror slipped away from accountability. Whether he died in rubble or lived in hiding, never brought to justice. No trial, no sentence, no public reckoning. For survivors of the Gestapo's victims, Mueller's disappearance was a bitter injustice. The man responsible for so much suffering vanished without consequence. Absence of a body meant the absence of closure. Mueller's fate remains one of the war's unresolved questions. Likely dead, possibly escaped, certainly gone, into the ruins, the chaos, or the shadows. The architect of terror became a ghost, and history has not found him. 23. Hans Kammler, the man who managed the V2. Vanished SS General Hans Kammler was responsible for Nazi Germany's late war secret weapons programs, including the V2 rocket and underground production facilities built by forced labor. He oversaw construction of vast subterranean factories, directed the deployment of rockets against Allied cities, and coordinated projects that killed thousands of slave laborers. As the war ended, whereabouts became uncertain. Various accounts placed him in different locations. Some said he committed suicide in Czechoslovakia. Others claimed he was killed by his own men. Still others suggested he escaped to American custody, offering technical knowledge in exchange for protection. No body was recovered. No death certificate was issued. No post-war trial included him, like Mueller, vanished. The competing accounts reflect the chaos of the war's final weeks. The Nazi command structure fractured, fought, or surrendered. Records were destroyed. Loyalty shifted. In that confusion, a man like Kammler could disappear. Side was reported by witnesses who claimed to be present. Kammler allegedly shot himself as Soviet or American forces closed in, death over capture. But the witnesses were few, their testimony inconsistent, and no grave was identified. Execution by subordinates is another theory. Kammler was reportedly unpopular among those who served under him. Ordered a retreat or action that endangered his staff, they might have killed him. But, again, no confirmed evidence, no body, no confession, corroboration. Escape to Allied custody is the most intriguing theory. Kammler possessed knowledge of rocket technology, underground construction, and advanced weapons. Both American and Soviet intelligence aggressively recruited German scientists and engineers after the war. Kammler, as a senior figure in these programs, would have been a prize. Declassified documents show American forces interrogated many V2 engineers and brought them to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Kammler's name appears in files, but no definitive proof of his custody exists. If he was taken into protective custody, identity might have been hidden to avoid public backlash. He was an SS officer tied to slave labor and war crimes. Forces also captured German scientists. If Kammler fell into their hands, he might have been interrogated, used, and then disposed of, unrecorded or deliberately obscured. The lack of resolution reflects broader patterns. The war's end was not a clean break, incomplete. People lied, identities were hidden, and the priorities of intelligence agencies, obtaining knowledge, securing defectors, denying them to rivals, sometimes overrode justice. For those who suffered under Kammler's authority, forced laborers who built the tunnels, killed by V2 strikes, his disappearance was another wound. He was never held accountable, never tried, never sentenced. Whether he died in hiding or lived protected by intelligence services, he escaped the reckoning others faced. Kammler's case exemplifies the moral ambiguities of the post-war period. Knowledge was valuable. Scientists who designed weapons of terror were recruited because their expertise was seen as strategically necessary. The question of justice took second place to the question of utility. But without a body, without confirmed death or confirmed custody, fate remains speculation. He might have died in a ditch, unmourned and unmarked. He might have lived years under an assumed name, protected by governments eager for his secrets. The truth, if it exists, locked in archives that may never open, or may have been destroyed long ago. The mystery endures because Kammler represents the war's unfinished business, criminals who were never caught, questions never answered, accountability never delivered. The machinery he built was real. The deaths he caused were real. But his own end remains unreal by doubt and the suspicion that justice was sacrificed for expediency. History recorded his crimes. It could not record his death, and so he remains missing, a name attached to atrocities, a ghost in the records, a question that the end of the war did not answer in 1905, but the questions did not. Across 6 years of global conflict, tens of millions died. Battles were documented, celebrated, defeats analyzed. The machinery of war, tanks, ships, aircraft, bombs, was catalogued with precision. Strategies were debated, judged. The broad strokes of World War II are known, but within that vast record lie gaps, men who disappeared, that sank without witness. Decisions made for reasons never fully captured. Explosions without definitive cause. Leaders who vanished into the chaos of war's end. Mysteries persist not because the war was poorly documented. It was the most recorded conflict in history. But because documentation has limits. Ships sink beyond salvage, files are destroyed or classified, and some truths are carried only in the memories of those who did not survive to share them. The halt at Dunkirk changed the war's course, yet the motives behind it remain debated. A submarine sent its last message and sank into silence. A carrier burned and capsized in a Scottish anchorage. A bomber flew over the desert until it crashed, crew walking to their deaths believing rescue was near. A diplomat saved thousands, only to be taken by the very forces that had ended the Holocaust, his fate obscured by decades of Soviet denial. These stories share a common thread: the absence of survivors, of wreckage, of records, of certainty. They are the war's missing pieces. Events that happened but left incomplete trails, questions that archival research and forensic analysis can narrow but not always close. The mysteries matter because they remind us that even the most documented conflict in human history contains silences. History is not a complete record. It is a reconstruction, built from fragments, shaped by what survived. And what survived is not always enough. For the families of the missing, the unanswered questions are not academic. They are absences at the dinner table, names without graves, without closure. The son who flew into fog and never returned. The sailor whose ship exploded and sank in minutes. The prisoner of war whose transport was torpedoed. The leader who disappeared into Soviet custody. For historians, the mysteries are reminders of epistemological limits. We can know much. We cannot know everything, and the humility to acknowledge uncertainty is as important as the confidence to assert fact. The Second World War reshaped the world. It ended empires, redrew borders, birthed the atomic age, and set the stage for the Cold War. Its legacy is vast and undeniable. Within that legacy are gaps: men swallowed by the sea, lost in the desert, taken into custody and never seen again, for reasons debated. Crashes that left no survivors to explain. Explosions that destroyed the evidence of their own cause. Mysteries will likely remain. The wrecks lie too deep. The witnesses are gone. The files are incomplete. And time, which should clarify, memory fades. Survivors die. Archives decay. What remains is the record as we have it, detailed, vast yet incomplete. The war is over. The questions endure. And the ocean, the desert, the archives, and the earth keep their secrets, giving back only what they choose, when they choose, or not at all.